He grabbed her by the wrist and dragged her onto the platform like she was a sack of grain. The crowd didn't flinch. Some of them laughed. "Blind, broken, and borderline mad," the auctioneer called out, his voice rolling across the frozen square like he was selling a lame horse. "Who'll take her off the county's hands for $1? Hell, we'd take 50 cents if you fed her through winter." Lydia Rowan stood on that platform with her chin up and her hands shaking, snow melting in her hair, wearing a dress that had been somebody else's before it was hers. She couldn't see the faces, but she could hear them. Every snicker, every whispered cruelty, every silence that was worse than the rest. If that were you up there, blind, alone, being sold to strangers for less than a loaf of bread, would anyone step forward? One man did. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, if they remind you that courage still exists in this world, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Redstone Crossing. 1876. The winter that changed everything. The cold that settled over Redstone Crossing in December of 1876 was the kind that got into your bones and stayed there. Not just the temperature, though that was brutal enough, 17 below on the worst nights. The kind of cold that turned breath into smoke and froze the water in the troughs before noon. It was something else, too. Something in the character of the place itself. A meanness. A smallness. The way a town gets when it's been cut off from the rest of the world by mountains and weather and its own particular brand of cruelty for too long. The town square was nothing much to look at, even in summer. A packed dirt clearing surrounded by a general store, a saloon called the Broken Spur, a sheriff's office with a crooked door, a feed and grain merchant, and a boarding house that had seen better decades. In winter, it was worse. The mud had frozen into hard ridges that caught at boot heels. The single gas lamp post in the center threw yellow light that barely reached the edges of the crowd gathered around the wooden platform that had been erected the night before. Most people in Redstone Crossing had never attended a public auction of a human being, but most people in Redstone Crossing had also never seen anything much beyond their own front porches. And when the county deputy sheriff rode through with the notice 3 days prior, nailing it to the post outside the Broken Spur, curiosity did what it always did in a small town with not enough to occupy itself. It brought people out. There were maybe 40 of them standing in the cold that morning. Men in heavy coats, women who'd brought their children and were already regretting it, a few older boys who'd come looking for something to snicker about. The blacksmith had left his forge. The schoolteacher, a thin woman named Mrs. Garfield, who rarely appeared in public outside of church, stood near the back with her arms folded and her expression unreadable. And at the far edge of the crowd, slightly apart from the rest, stood Elias Mercer. He was not the kind of man who announced himself. He was somewhere in his late 30s, though he looked older in the way that men who've spent years outdoors always do. The skin weathered, the eyes settled deep into their sockets like they'd retreated there to protect themselves from something. He wore a long canvas duster that had been dark brown once and was now somewhere between brown and the color of old dirt. His hat was pulled low. He had a beard that wasn't quite kept and wasn't quite wild, and hands that were large and calloused and currently shoved into his coat pockets beat because the cold was vicious, and he had no particular reason to take them out. He had not come to the auction on purpose. He'd come into town for flour and lamp oil and a new file for his axe, and he'd been on his way back to his horse when the noise from the square caught his attention. Not the crowd noise. He'd learned long ago to tune out crowds. It was something else. A silence within the noise. A single moment where the jeering and the laughing all dropped off at once, and in that gap he heard something that made him stop walking. A woman's voice, low and controlled and very, very carefully not breaking. "I am not dangerous," she said. "I never was." He turned around. The platform was rough-hewn timber about 2 feet off the ground, and the man standing on it beside her was Deputy Calvin Hatch, a round-shouldered, thin-mustached man who had been known to Elias by reputation for 3 years and by direct experience for 2, and neither acquaintance had given him a high opinion of the man. Hatch had a sheet of paper in one hand and a self-important expression on his face that suggested he felt this was the most significant thing he'd done all year. He was probably right, which was its own kind of tragedy. "Lydia Rowan," Hatch announced, his voice carrying across the square with the practiced ease of a man who liked to be heard. "Formerly of the Cassidy boarding house on Mill Road, currently a ward of Harlan County on account of being unable to support herself and having been previously detained on charges of... Those charges were dismissed, Lydia said. Not loudly, just clearly. The way you speak when you've said something 100 times and stopped expecting anyone to listen. Charges were investigated, Hatch corrected, with the particular satisfaction of a man holding a technicality, and the matter was set aside pending, which is not the same as dismissed, as I'm sure you're aware. She wasn't looking at him. She couldn't look at anyone. Her eyes were open, but they moved in the unfocused way that told you immediately there was no sight in them, just the pale gray blue of eyes that had given up trying. She was maybe 23, 24 at the most, and she was thin in the way of someone who hadn't been eating well for a long time. The dress she wore was clean, but it was the wrong weight for the weather, and she was holding herself very still, Elias noticed, the way people do when they're trying to stop themselves from shaking. Starting price, Hatch announced, consulting his paper with great ceremony, is set at $1. Any taker covers cost of her housing through winter and assumes responsibility for her welfare and employment. County's done with it. Silence. Not sympathetic silence. Calculating silence. The kind where people were running numbers in their heads and the numbers weren't coming out in Lydia's favor. Then somebody, Elias never identified who, though he had his suspicions, said something from the middle of the crowd that got a laugh. A real laugh. The kind that spreads because people are relieved to have permission. And suddenly there were 2 or 3 more comments, and the laughter grew, and Lydia stood on that platform in the middle of all of it with her chin lifted and her jaw tight, and her hands shaking at her sides. Elias felt something move through him that wasn't quite anger. Anger was too clean a word for it. It was something older and less comfortable. The recognition of a specific kind of wrong that he'd encountered enough times in his life to know exactly what it looked like and exactly what it tended to produce if nobody stepped in front of it. He'd stepped in front of things before. It hadn't always gone well. He stepped forward anyway. "$1," he said. His voice wasn't loud either. But the crowd heard it, the way crowds always hear the unexpected, and the laughter died down into a murmur of confusion as people turned to look at him. Hatch squinted from the platform. "Mercer? You heard me. You want the girl?" The word girl landed wrong, and Elias saw Lydia's jaw tighten further at it, though she didn't turn toward the sound of his voice. She was listening. He could tell she was listening to everything, constructing the world around her out of nothing but sound and temperature and the particular quality of attention that sighted people rarely developed because they never had to. "I'm making the bid," Elias said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a silver dollar and held it up so Hatch could see it catch the light. "Unless someone else is interested." He looked at the crowd when he said it. The crowd looked at their boots. Hatch blinked. He consulted his paper again, though Elias doubted there was anything on it that covered this specific situation. "Well, yes. County accepts. Payment up front." Elias walked to the platform and set the dollar on the edge of the boards. He did not hand it to Hatch directly. He didn't particularly want to touch the man's hands. "Ma'am," he said to Lydia. She turned toward him. Her face was cautious and complicated, and she did not look grateful. She looked like a person who had been disappointed so many times that gratitude had become a risk she wasn't willing to take without more information. "Who are you?" she asked. "Elias Mercer. I've got a cabin about 12 miles northeast. I'm going back to it today, and you can come or you can stay here. Your choice." "That's not much of a choice." "I know it." A pause. The crowd was watching. Hatch had pocketed the dollar and was already losing interest, the way bureaucrats do once the paperwork portion of a thing is concluded. "What do you want from me?" Lydia asked. Her voice was careful. Not hostile exactly. More like she was reading the fine print on an offer that looked too straightforward to be real. "Nothing," Elias said. "I've got a spare room. It's cold out here." She stood there for a moment on that platform, with the wind cutting across the square and the crowd still watching and the lamppost throwing its inadequate yellow light over all of it. And Elias could see her working through it, all of it, the probabilities, the risks, the fact that 12 miles northeast in a mountain cabin with a stranger she couldn't see was not, objectively speaking, a safe option, but that the alternative was standing on this platform until Hatch decided to try the auction again tomorrow, with the same crowd and the same laughter and the same outcome. She stepped off the platform. She nearly stumbled at the edge. The drop was 2 feet and she hadn't known exactly where it was. And Elias put out his arm without thinking, and she caught it and caught herself, and then straightened up and let go of his arm faster than was strictly necessary. 12 miles, she said. Give or take. Do you talk much? Not if I can help it. She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more the shadow of one, the muscle memory of an expression she hadn't used in a while. All right, she said, lead the way. The crowd parted for them, not respectfully, more the way crowds part for things they don't understand and therefore don't want to touch. Elias heard the comments starting up again as they walked, the speculations about his sanity, the theories about his motivations, the general consensus of Redstone Crossing that he'd made a fool's bargain. He'd made enough of those in his life that one more didn't trouble him much. His horse, a big gray gelding named Fletcher, that had survived 3 years of rough mountain country through a combination of stubbornness and selective deafness, was hitched outside the general store where Elias had left him. He untied the reins and looked back at Lydia, who had followed him by the sound of his footsteps, her hand trailing along the wall of the building when there was a wall to trail along, stepping carefully over the frozen ridges in the ground. You can ride? He asked. I can sit on a horse, she said. Riding implies some control over the situation. Sitting's fine. He paused. I'll boost you up. Warn me before you touch me. I'm going to put my hand on your left elbow and my right hand at your waist to help you up. The stirrup is about 2 feet to your left. A beat. Thank you, she said, like the words cost her something. He boosted her up into the saddle and she settled there with more steadiness than he'd expected. She'd ridden before, or at least she hadn't been lying about being able to sit a horse. He swung up behind her, gathered the reins, and put Fletcher toward the northeast road. Nobody waved them off. Nobody said good luck. The cold closed around them as they left the town behind. For the first hour, neither of them spoke, which suited Elias fine and seemed to suit Lydia at least as well. She sat in front of him with her back not quite touching his chest, maintaining a deliberate inch of space between them, which he respected, and her hands resting on the saddle horn, and her face turned slightly toward the wind, the way she moved through the world by feel and sound and direction. He watched her without making it obvious. It was a habit from his scouting years, reading people, reading terrain, looking for the things that mattered underneath the surface of things. What he read in Lydia Rowan was not what the town had told him to expect. They'd called her mad. The notice on the post had called her potentially volatile in the careful language of official documents that want to say something without quite saying it. Hatch had called her dangerous with the casual confidence of a man who'd never reconsidered a first impression in his life. What she looked like to Elias was exhausted, not physically, though probably that too, but the deeper kind of tired, the kind that settles into a person after too long fighting something that keeps finding new shapes. She held herself with the rigid posture of someone who had learned that composure was armor, and that once you let it slip, people used the gap. The charges, he said after a while. What were they? She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. A man at the boarding house, she said finally. He came to my room. I defended myself. He said I attacked him without provocation. A pause. He was well regarded. I was the blind girl who nobody could quite verify. The investigation went the way you'd expect. He's still in Redstone Crossing? He left about 6 months after, but the story stayed. Elias turned this over in his mind. How long were you at the county house? 8 months? And before that? A longer pause. I grew up in Millhaven, about 40 miles east. My mother died when I was 15. I had an uncle who took me in for a while, but she stopped, started again. I've been moving around since I was 18. The boarding house was the longest I'd stayed anywhere. How long? 2 years. She said it like 2 years was a long time. He supposed it was, depending on what the alternative was. You lost your sight, he said. Was that born this way? She said, and her voice had the faint edge of someone who'd answered this question too many times. I can see light and shadow. Sometimes shapes, if they're very close and the light is right. Not enough to navigate, not enough to read, not enough for most of what people think of as useful. You seem to manage. I manage fine, she said, with a sharpness that wasn't quite anger but was adjacent to it. That's what I was trying to explain to the county. I can cook and clean and sew and carry water and do laundry and take care of a household. I was doing exactly that at the boarding house for 2 years. None of that stopped being true because of what that man said about me. I believe you. She turned her face slightly, as though trying to locate him more precisely. Do you? I wouldn't have said it otherwise. Another silence, different from the first one, less guarded. Why did you do it? She asked. The auction. You didn't know me. He thought about how to answer that honestly without making it into something it wasn't. I've seen that look before, he said, not on you specifically. But I've seen what happens when a crowd decides someone isn't worth the trouble and nobody gets in the way of it. What happens? Bad things. I've done enough of those myself that I try to prevent them when I can. She turned this over. You said you were a scout. Former. What made you stop? He was quiet for a beat too long, and she seemed to hear the shape of that pause because she didn't press it. All right, she said. That was the end of that conversation. Fletcher carried them up the trail that climbed northeast out of the valley, threading between stands of pine that grew thick on either side and cut the wind down to something tolerable. The light was failing by the time they reached the elevation where the snow was deeper, and Elias watched the sky and judged they had about an hour before dark. The cabin came into view around a bend in the trail, and Elias always felt something complicated when he first saw it after time away, something he couldn't quite name. He'd built most of it himself over 2 summers, from timber he'd cut on the property. It was not beautiful. It was low and solid and dark against the snow, with a fieldstone chimney and one window facing south, and a porch that was more of a structural suggestion than an actual porch. But it stood. 3 winters it had stood, and none of them had been gentle. He helped Lydia down from the horse, warned her first, as she'd asked, and led Fletcher to the small lean-to shed on the north side where he kept 2 other horses in the winter feed. You have other horses? Lydia said. She'd heard them shift at Fletcher's approach. 2 mules and an old mare. The mules do the heavy work. How much land? About 40 acres cleared. Rest is timber. He opened the shed door and led Fletcher in. I trap some, sell furs in spring, grow what I can in summer. She was listening, building the map. He could tell. You live here alone? I do. Were you expecting company? No. He said it simply because it was true, and there was a pause in which she seemed to weigh the implications of that and find them acceptable, or at least not immediately alarming. Inside, this cabin was cold. He'd been in town 3 days, and the fire had long since died. He went straight to the hearth and started building it back up, and Lydia stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped carefully inside, one hand touching the doorframe and then releasing it, her foot testing the floor for differences in level before she committed her weight. Tell me about the room, she said. He looked up from the fire. What do you need to know? Everything. Start from where I'm standing. So he did. He told her, without condescension, without the careful slowness people sometimes used when they talked to her like she was also hard of hearing, exactly what was in the cabin and where. The hearth, 6 feet ahead and slightly left. The table, pine, 2 chairs, another 8 feet past that. The kitchen side, running along the east wall, with the iron cook stove and the shelves and the dry goods he kept in sealed tin canisters. The bedroom, through the door on the right, single bed and a chest and a hook on the wall. The spare room, such as it was, he used it for storage, but there was a narrow cot in there that he'd slept on when he'd had a partner winter over 3 years ago. The floor's got a loose board about 4 feet from the hearth on the left side, he said. I'll fix it this week. Till then, step around it. Which direction is the door from the hearth? Back and right. 11 steps if you walk straight. She nodded, processing all of it. Then she walked, carefully but steadily, to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down, and Elias watched her settle into the space without comment because there wasn't anything useful to say about it. She was doing what she'd always done. She was learning the terrain. The fire caught. The cold began to give ground slowly, the way cold always does, grudgingly and not all at once. I don't need to be taken care of, Lydia said to the fire. Not to him particularly, just to the room. I didn't think you did, Elias said. She turned her face toward him. That particular precise stillness again, really listening, checking. Most people do. Most people are wrong about most things. The fire popped and sent up a shower of sparks. Outside, the wind was picking up, pushing against the walls with a sound like pressure, like something testing the seams. "I'll make supper," Lydia said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't." She pushed back the chair. "Tell me where the cook stove is again," he told her. She stood, oriented herself, and walked toward it without hesitation. She found the edge of the stove with her fingertips and began exploring the surface of the kitchen shelves in the methodical, efficient way of someone who'd spent years turning unknown spaces into known ones. Elias watched her for a moment. Then he went back to tending the fire, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and somehow that felt like the beginning of something rather than the absence of it. She burned the first batch of cornbread. Not badly, just enough to be noticeable, the bottom crust going from golden to something darker before she caught the smell and pulled it back. She didn't apologize for it. She just set it on the table and said, "The oven runs hot," in the tone of a statement of fact rather than an excuse. "It does," Elias agreed. "You could have told me. You told me you didn't need to be taken care of." A pause. "That's different from telling me relevant information about the equipment." "You're right," he said. "My fault. It runs about 50 degrees hot on the right side, less on the left." She considered this. "All right." She cut the cornbread without further comment. "It tasted fine." He said so. "I know," she said. "I can tell by the smell." He almost smiled at that. Almost. After supper, she asked him about the spare room again. Could she find her way to it from the table? Could he walk her through it once before she was on her own? He did, and she committed it to memory with a thoroughness that impressed him even though he'd thought himself past the point of being impressed by most things. At the door of the spare room, she stopped and turned partway toward him. The firelight from the main room reached this far, just barely, though it meant nothing to her. "Elias," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name. "Yeah. If I scream, it means something is actually wrong, not that I've knocked something over or gotten turned around." A pause. "I know you probably know that. I'm just telling you anyway." "Understood," he said. She went into the room. He heard the rope springs of the cot settle under her weight, and then nothing. He sat by the fire for a long time after, the cabin settling around him with its familiar creaks and drafts, and he thought about what he'd done today and whether it was the right thing. He did that with most decisions, turned them over afterward, looking for the cracks. It was a habit that had saved him a few times and tortured him more times than that. This time he couldn't find the crack. He could find uncertainty, plenty of it. He didn't know who Lydia Rowan was beyond what she'd told him and what he'd read in her in 3 hours of observation. He didn't know what the county would say when Hatch filed his paperwork. He didn't know what the man from the boarding house had left behind him in the way of grudges or complications. What he knew was that she'd stood on that platform in the cold with her chin up, and nobody had moved, and that had struck him as the kind of wrong that tends to compound itself if left alone. He'd been wrong about things before. He'd be wrong about things again. But the fire was burning and the wind was outside where it belonged, and somewhere in the next room, Lydia Rowan was sleeping in a place where nobody was laughing at her. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing. Well, 3 days passed without incident, or rather, 3 days passed with the ordinary small incidents of two people learning to occupy the same space without colliding, which in its own way required more navigation than actual incidents would have. Lydia woke before him both mornings and had the cook stove going before he came out of the bedroom, which he hadn't expected. When he said so, she pointed out that she had nothing to occupy her before dawn and a great deal to keep her mind from, and that cooking was better than lying in the dark thinking. He understood that. He didn't say so, but she seemed to read it in his silence because she didn't elaborate. She learned the cabin the way water learns a vessel, finding every corner and angle, returning to uncertain spots until they were certain, never asking twice for the same information. By the second day, she was moving through the main room without touching the walls. By the third, she'd found the loose board by the hearth herself, and was avoiding it with a precision that made him feel mildly embarrassed about having left it that long. He fixed it on the fourth day. She didn't comment. What she did comment on was the lack of books. "You don't read," she said. It wasn't a question. "I read. I just don't keep books." He was at the table, working on a piece of harness leather that needed re-sewing. "They're heavy when you move." "Do you move often?" "Used to." She was sitting on the other side of the table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She'd found the coffee beans in the grinder herself, which he was choosing not to make a fuss about, though she'd ground about twice as much as necessary. "You don't move now?" "No, I've been here 3 years. What made you stop?" The same question, more or less, as she'd asked on the horse. He'd avoided it then by being quiet long enough. He found he didn't want to avoid it this time, though he wasn't entirely sure why. "I was in a bad situation," he said, "for a long time. Frontier work, scouting, mostly, some contract work that I don't care to think about now. I made some choices I had to live with and some choices I didn't get to choose, and eventually I needed to stop being in the kind of places where those choices kept getting made." He set down the leather and the awl. "This place was far enough from everything that I thought it would stick." "And does it?" "Most days." She turned her mug between her palms, thinking. "The people in town, they know you?" "Some of them." "And they don't bother you out here?" "They don't have a reason to come out here, and most of them wouldn't want to make the trip in winter." He picked up the leather again. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I don't know what kind of trouble might follow me," she said, "and I'd rather you knew that before it arrived instead of after." He looked at her over the table. "What kind of trouble are you expecting?" "The man from the boarding house," she said. "Wesley Crane. He left Redstone Crossing, but he didn't go far. He's in Mill Haven, last I heard. He has money, and he has pride, and he has a story that says, 'I'm the dangerous one.'" She set the mug down carefully, finding the table's edge with her fingertip first. "He didn't press charges because he'd have had to explain what he was doing in my room, but he made sure the story spread. And if he finds out that someone's taken me on—" "He'd what?" Elias said. "Come after you?" "He'd find a reason to. That's how men like that work. It's not about what happened. It's about the fact that I'm still here, and he didn't finish the job of making me disappear." The word disappear landed in the room with some weight behind it. Elias put the harness leather down again, slowly. "How long have you known he's in Mill Haven?" 4 months? Someone at the county house told me. They weren't supposed to, but—" a faint, humorless shape to her mouth. "People tell blind women things. They think we're not a threat, so they're not careful." "That's their mistake," Elias said. "It has been," she agreed quietly. Outside, the wind shifted direction, and somewhere in the pines east of the cabin something moved, probably just the mules reacting to the cold snap. But Elias found himself listening to it a beat longer than usual. "Lydia," he said. "Yes." "Whatever's coming, I'm not going to stand aside from it." He said it flat, not dramatic about it, just a fact he wanted to put on the table so she could factor it in. "That's not a promise I make easily, but I'm making it." She sat with it for a moment. He couldn't tell what she was thinking. Her face, when she chose it, could be as opaque as his own. "I'll hold you to that," she said finally. "Good." He picked the leather back up. She picked up her mug. The fire ticked and the wind pushed at the seams of the cabin, and somewhere to the east, probably just the mules, something moved again through the trees. And on the 6th morning, Elias found tracks in the snow outside the tree line. 2 horses. Neither of them his. Stopped for a while based on the depth the hooves had settled into the crust. Stopped long enough that whoever was in the saddle had been watching the cabin. Then turned around and ridden back down the trail toward town. He stood in the cold looking at those tracks for a long time before he went back inside. He didn't tell Lydia, not yet. But he moved the rifle from the bedroom to its hook by the front door, and he slept lighter that night, and every night after, listening to the particular quality of the dark outside for the sound of something that wasn't just the wind. He didn't tell her about the tracks for 3 days. That was a mistake, and he knew it while he was making it, which didn't stop him from making it. He told himself he was waiting until he had more information, which was partly true. He also told himself he didn't want to alarm her before he understood what he was looking at, which was partly true too. But underneath both of those things was something less defensible. The fact that the cabin had settled into a rhythm over those first 6 days that felt fragile in the specific way that good things feel fragile when you're not used to them, and he didn't want to be the one to break it. The rhythm was simple. Lydia woke first and started the stove. Elias came out and fed the animals while the coffee brewed. They ate together without much conversation, and then they split into their separate work. Him outside with the traps and the wood splitting and the general maintenance that a mountain property demanded in winter, Her inside with the cooking and the cleaning and the quiet, systematic project of making herself more capable in the space. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking in the loose, exploratory way of people who are still figuring out what the other one is made of. He didn't think of it as peace, exactly. He'd had enough years of rough country to be suspicious of anything that felt like peace. But it was something, a working quiet, the kind that had to be earned. He didn't want to break it with bad news he couldn't yet explain. On the 7th morning, he told her. She was at the cook stove, adjusting the damper by the sound of the fire inside it. She'd learned the difference between the sounds of a fire running too hot and too cool within 4 days, which had impressed him, though he hadn't said so. And he sat down at the table and said, "There were tracks outside the tree line a few days ago, 2 horses. They were watching the cabin." The damper clicked. She didn't turn around. "How long ago?" "6 mornings back." "And you're telling me now?" "I am." She turned then, and her face did something complicated. Not angry exactly, more like a person recalibrating, sorting through the feeling to get at what was actually useful in it. "Did you see anything after that?" "No, I've checked the tree line every morning. Tracks were just the one time." "That doesn't mean they stopped watching. It means they stopped leaving tracks you could find." He looked at her. "That's right. So they're not amateurs." "Probably not." She came to the table and sat down across from him, which was what she did when she was thinking seriously about something. Finding the chair, settling her hands on the table surface, anchoring herself in the space. "Was it Crane?" she asked. "I don't know. Could be him. Could be someone working for him." Elias turned his coffee mug in his hands. "Could be someone the county sent. I don't fully trust Hatch's paperwork to stay clean." "Hatch wouldn't send riders," she said. "He's lazy. He'd send a letter." "Then probably not Hatch, which brings us back to Crane." She was quiet for a moment. "He has money. He's used to getting things done through other people so his hands stay clean." She tapped one finger on the table, once, not impatiently, but thoughtfully. "If he's already watching, then he knows where I am, which means whatever he's planning, he's not in a hurry. He's building toward something. Men like that usually are. Which means we have some time." "Not much, but some." She stopped tapping. "I want a weapon." Elias was quiet for a beat. "You know how to use one?" "I know how to fire a rifle. I was taught when I was a girl. I won't hit anything at distance, obviously, but if someone is close enough, that distance doesn't matter." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "I've got a small revolver," he said. "Single action, .32 caliber. It's lighter than the rifle, easier to handle in close quarters." "Can I hold it?" He got up, went to the bedroom, came back with the revolver and cleared the cylinder before he set it on the table in front of her. She found it with her hands and lifted it, testing the weight, finding the balance point, running her thumb over the hammer and the trigger guard with the methodical attention she brought to everything new. "Show me how to load it," she said. He did, twice. The third time she did it herself, slowly, finding each chamber by touch, seating each round by feel. Her hands were steady. He noticed that. He also noticed that she was holding her breath without realizing it, and when the cylinder clicked shut, she let it out all at once. "Where do I keep it?" she asked. "Bedroom. Hook on the wall to the left of the door. Same height as your shoulder." She nodded, memorizing it. Then she set the revolver down with the care of something that mattered. "You should have told me sooner," she said. Not accusatory. Just placing the fact somewhere they could both see it. "Yeah," he said. "I should have." She picked up her coffee. "Don't do it again." "I won't." They finished breakfast in a different kind of quiet than the one they'd been building. Sharper, more honest. He found after a while that he preferred it. The snow came back that afternoon in a way it hadn't for nearly a week. Serious snow, not the flurries that dusted the top of the existing pack, but a steady, heavy fall that cut visibility down to 30 yards by midday and to nothing useful by early afternoon. Elias got the animals secured and extra feed put out and came back inside with snow packed into every seam of his coat, and Lydia had the fire built up and soup on the stove and the revolver on the hook by the bedroom door where he'd told her to put it. "If anyone's in the tree line right now," she said, without looking up from the pot, "they're miserable." "Probably." "Good." He almost laughed. Not quite. but almost. The blizzard ran for 2 days. In those 2 days, confined to the cabin by weather that made even the distance to the lean-to a genuine navigational problem, they talked more than they had in the previous week combined. Not about the riders, or about Crane, or about anything that came attached to danger. They'd both seemed to silently agree that those subjects were already on the table and didn't need rehashing. They talked about other things, the geography of the territory, what Lydia remembered of Millhaven before she'd left, the way Elias had ended up in Redstone Crossing at all, which involved a chain of circumstances he told in the abbreviated way of someone who's edited a longer story down to what's bearable. She told him about the boarding house in more detail than she'd offered before. 2 years at Mrs. Cassidy's, running a clean room, doing laundry, taking her meals with the other boarders, learning the rhythms of the place with the same patience she brought to every space. She'd been, by her own account, unremarkable in all the best ways, present but not intrusive, useful but not servile, managing her blindness so efficiently that some of the longer-term boarders had admitted to occasionally forgetting it. That was the thing about Wesley Crane, she said, on the second evening of the blizzard. They were on opposite sides of the hearth, him in the chair and her on the three-legged stool she'd appropriated as her preferred seat, and the fire between them was doing the kind of substantial work that made the outside world feel genuinely far away. He noticed that people forgot, and that bothered him. He wanted me to be reduced in the way that he thought I was supposed to be. What do you mean? He'd do small things, move something I'd placed carefully so I'd trip on it, answer questions about me that were directed to me, tell people what I wanted to eat, what I needed, that sort of thing, in front of me as though I wasn't there. She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. When I stopped letting him do it, he escalated. And the night he came to your room, I'd locked the door. She said it flatly. He had a key, not a master key. He'd gotten a key made somehow. I heard him on the stairs first, then the lock, and I was across the room before he was inside, and I had a fireplace poker in my hand. A pause. I hit him twice, not enough to do serious damage, but enough that he left, and enough that he was furious about it. He went to the sheriff. The next morning, said I'd attacked him in the hallway, said I was unstable, said the boarding house wasn't safe with me in it. She was very still. The sheriff was a friend of his, or at least the kind of friend that's really a professional convenience. She picked at the thread again, and it came loose, and she tucked it into her palm. Mrs. Cassidy didn't speak up. I understood why. He was a paying boarder. I was the woman no one could quite verify. Elias had been listening without interrupting, which was how he listened to most things, completely, and without offering the small verbal nods and agreements that some people used to show they were paying attention. He'd found over the years that people often told you more if you didn't keep filling the space between their sentences. The witness, he said, when she'd been quiet for a moment. Was there one? She looked toward him, slightly surprised. What do you know about a witness? Nothing. I'm asking. Another pause, longer than the others. There was a girl, young, maybe 16. She was in the hallway when Crane left my room. She saw him. She saw the state of him. Lydia's hands tightened around each other in her lap, briefly. I gave her name to the sheriff. He said she'd been spoken to and had nothing useful to say. Did you believe that? No, I believe she was terrified. She'd have been... Crane's money reached a long way in that town. Still does. A breath. Her name is Rose Bennett. I don't know where she is now. He filed that away. Rose Bennett. 16, or near it, 2 years ago. Old enough now to make her own choices about what she was willing to say. What happened after the sheriff? Elias asked. The county took me, called it protective custody, which was a way of saying they didn't know what to do with me, and neither did anyone else. I was there 8 months until Hatch decided the cheapest solution was the auction. She said it without self-pity, which was somehow worse than if there'd been self-pity. And now I'm here. And now you're here, Elias agreed. The fire settled, sending up a brief brightness. Outside, the blizzard was finally easing. He could tell by the way the sound of it changed, the howling dropping off into a lower register. Elias, she said. Yeah. What happened to you? In the frontier work, what was it that made you need to stop? He was quiet for long enough that the fire shifted twice. I was part of a campaign, he said. against a group of people who hadn't done what we were told they'd done. I found that out about 2/3 of the way through, and I didn't stop it. I should have. I told myself I didn't have the standing, that the order was above me, that one man pulling out wouldn't have changed anything. He looked at his hands. None of those things were as true as I wanted them to be. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault, which was what people usually said, and which was never precisely true. She just sat with it, the way you sit with something heavy that can't be put down but can be shared. Is that why you stepped forward? She asked. At the auction. Probably part of it. Not because of me specifically. I didn't know you specifically. No. A pause. Do you know me now? Somewhat? Somewhat, he said. She almost smiled, the same muscle memory shadow of one as before, but a little closer to the surface this time. All right, she said. That's enough for now. The blizzard broke overnight, and the morning that followed was the particular kind of brutal clear that comes after heavy mountain snow. Every surface catching light, the sky an almost painful blue, the cold dry and absolute. Elias went out to check the tree line before he checked the animals. No fresh tracks, which meant either the riders had moved on, or the blizzard had covered 2 days' worth of activity, or they were staying well back and being more careful. He stood in the bright cold and looked at the tree line for a while, reading the gaps between the trunks the way he'd been trained to read them, looking for the particular stillness that meant something was trying not to be noticed. He didn't see anything, but the feeling didn't leave him. Back inside, over breakfast, he said, I want to start teaching you the land. Lydia looked up from her plate. The land around the cabin? The trail down to the road, the tree line on the north and east, the creek at the bottom of the east slope. It runs fast enough that it doesn't freeze solid. It makes a sound you can navigate by. He was eating as he talked, not performing seriousness, but not diminishing it either. If something happens when I'm outside and you need to get somewhere that isn't this cabin, I want you to be able to do it. She put her fork down. You think it's going to come to that? I don't know. But I'd rather you could, and not need to, than need to, and couldn't. She thought about that. When do we start? Today, if you're willing. I'm willing. He spent the morning walking her through the immediate terrain around the cabin, the porch, the lean-to, the chopping block, the path between all three. He walked it with her 4 times, talking through every landmark she could use that wasn't visual, the change in the sound of the wind as you moved between the cabin's windward and leeward sides, the slight downhill slope that started 20 feet east of the porch and ran toward the creek, the smell of the pine stand on the north edge versus the more open, colder air of the clearing, the change in ground texture from packed snow to the rougher, drifted surface of the uncleared area beyond the chopping block. She didn't complain about the cold, though it was severe. She didn't rush him or ask him to abbreviate anything. She walked each path until she'd built it solidly, and when she made a mistake, misjudging the edge of the porch once and stepping down harder than expected, she corrected without comment and went again. Around midday, she said, You're a decent teacher. I've had decent students before. What did you teach? Younger scouts, reading terrain, moving quietly. He paused. The main thing I ever taught anyone was to pay attention to what was actually there instead of what they expected to find. You'd think that would be obvious. You'd think so, he agreed. It isn't. She did something with her face that he was starting to recognize. A small, private expression. Not quite amusement, not quite agreement, somewhere in between. He didn't have a name for it yet. He'd stopped trying to name everything about her the way he'd noticed he'd been doing in the first few days, cataloging, analyzing, the old scouting habit of reducing things to information. She was more useful to understand as a person than as a collection of data points. That afternoon, he taught her the first stretch of the trail down to the road, the first 100 yards, ending at the large boulder he used as a waypoint because it sat on the right side of the trail, exactly at the point where the path curved northeast. She found the boulder, both times they walked to it, by counting steps from the porch post and listening for the way the wind changed as the trees thickened on either side of the trail. 47 steps from the post, she said the second time. 38 if I lengthen my stride. Closer to 43 for the stride length. I'll check it again tomorrow. He looked at her standing in the cold beside the boulder, her hand resting on its surface, her face turned into the wind, the hard blue sky above the tree line. the snow running off the branches in small bright falls whenever the wind moved them. He didn't say what he thought, which was that she was going to be fine. Not because he didn't mean it, but because she didn't need him to say it. She was busy proving it to herself, which was a different and more durable thing. They went back to the cabin for coffee, and it was when they came through the door, stamping snow off their boots on the porch, that Elias saw it. A piece of paper, folded once, tucked under the door in the gap between the base of the door and the threshold. Not there when they'd left while they were on the trail, which meant whoever left it had been at the cabin while they were within 100 yards of it and hadn't made a sound. He picked it up without saying anything, and Lydia heard the change in him, the way his boots stopped moving, the particular quality of silence that followed, and said, "What is it?" "Paper. Note." He unfolded it, 4 words, in a cramped, functional hand. "No signature. Leave now, both of you." He read it twice. Then he read it to her. She stood in the doorway for a moment, one hand on the frame. "Both of us," she repeated. "That's what it says." "So whoever wrote it knows I'm here." "Yes. And they're warning us, not threatening us." "That's how I read it." She stepped fully inside and he followed her and he locked the door, 2 bolts, which he hadn't bothered with before, and put the note on the table where they could both think about it. "It could be Crane," she said, "trying to flush us out. Move us onto the road where we're exposed." "It could be," he agreed. "Or it could be someone else. Someone who knows something about what's coming and isn't on Crane's side of it." "Who would that be?" "I don't know yet." She sat down at the table, thinking hard. He could see her working through it, the same systematic way she worked through everything, testing angles, looking for the weight-bearing structure underneath the surface of the thing. "If we leave," she said, "we're on the road in winter with no certainty of where we're going and no advantage except movement. If we stay, we're holding a known position against an unknown threat." She folded her hands on the table. "And if the note is genuine, if someone is actually trying to help us, then leaving might be walking into something worse than staying." "That's about how I see it," Elias said. "So we stay. For now. But we prepare like we might not be able to." She nodded. "The revolver's on the hook." "I know. I'm going to move the rifle to the kitchen side. Faster access." He was already moving as he said it. "I'm also going to move some food and the medical kit to the lean-to. If we get separated from the cabin, we won't get separated from each other," she said. Her voice had an edge to it that wasn't quite a request. He looked at her across the room. "No," he said, "we won't." He spent the rest of the afternoon in preparation. Not frantic, not the kind of preparation that feeds on its own fear, but the steady, methodical variety he'd learned in years of frontier work. You readied things, you assessed what you had and what you needed, and you made the gap between them smaller. You didn't catastrophize, and you didn't pretend everything was fine. You just worked. Lydia worked too. She reorganized the kitchen shelves in a way that put the most necessary things within fastest reach. She went back outside in the cold and walked the path to the boulder twice more on her own, without him. He watched her from the porch the second time, not close enough to be of use if she needed it, just present enough to know she was all right. Was all right. That night, he slept in the chair by the door instead of the bedroom, the rifle across his knees. He told Lydia this, and she didn't argue. She did say, from the doorway of the spare room, "If you see something, wake me. Don't try to handle it alone." "I won't." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "I'll wake you," he said. "Thank you." He sat in the chair and watched the fire die down by inches and listened to the cabin and the mountain around it with the particular quality of attention that doesn't look for anything specific because it doesn't need to. It just stays open, ready for whatever shape the wrong thing happens to take when it arrives. Nothing arrived that night. But on the 9th morning, when Elias went out to feed the animals, there was a woman sitting on the boulder at the first bend of the trail. She was young, maybe 18 or 19, wrapped in a heavy coat that was too big for her, and she had the look of someone who'd been outside for a while and was very cold and very frightened and very determined not to show either. When she saw Elias, she stood up, and for a moment she looked like she was going to run, and then she didn't. "Is she here?" the girl said. Her voice was thin with cold. "Lydia Rowan. Is she here?" Elias looked at her for a long, measuring moment. "Who are you?" "My name is Rose," the girl said. "Rose Bennett, and I don't have much time." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, Come inside, get warm. Then you can tell me what you came to say." She followed him up the trail with the careful, fast steps of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and was afraid to stop moving in case the weight of it caught up. Behind him, the tree line sat still and pale in the morning cold. He didn't let himself turn around to look at it, but he walked a little faster than usual, and he did not breathe easily until they were inside with the door bolted behind them. Lydia was at the cook stove when they came in, and she heard the extra set of footsteps and went very still. "Elias," she said. "We have company," he said. "She says her name is Rose Bennett." The sound Lydia made then was not quite a word. It was something that came from somewhere below words, surprise and fear, and something that might have been hope, all pressed together into a single sharp exhale. Rose Bennett stood just inside the door, her cold reddened hands twisted together in front of her, and looked at Lydia with an expression that was equal parts terror and relief. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice broke slightly on it. "I'm so sorry. I should have said something 2 years ago. I know I should have. I've known every single day that I should have." She stopped, started again. "But I'm here now, and I'll say it now. Say it now. I'll say everything." She looked at Elias and then back at Lydia. "If you'll let me." Lydia turned fully away from the stove. Her face was controlled in the way it got when she was working hard to stay inside herself. "Sit down," she said finally. "Have some coffee, and then, yes, tell me everything." Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The mountain held its cold and its silence. And inside the small dark cabin, something that had been broken for 2 years began, slowly and imperfectly, to find the shape it had been looking for. Rose Bennett drank her coffee in small, careful sips, like someone who wasn't sure she deserved the warmth of it. She sat at the table across from Lydia, and Elias stayed by the door, not because he was guarding it exactly, but because the room felt like it needed someone at its edges, while the two women found their footing with each other. It took a few minutes. Lydia sat with both hands around her own mug and didn't rush it. Whatever she was feeling about Rose being in this cabin, and Elias could see it moving under the surface of her face, complicated and not entirely resolved, she was keeping it managed, just barely, but managed. Finally, Rose set her mug down and said, "He paid me." The words came out small and ashamed, like she'd been holding them in her chest so long they'd lost most of their air. "Crane," Lydia said. "Yes, not a lot. $20. But my mother was sick, and my father was gone, and $20 was—" She stopped. "That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. I've told myself that every night for 2 years." "What did he pay you to do?" Lydia's voice was even, careful. "To tell the sheriff I hadn't seen anything, that I'd been asleep, that I didn't know what happened in the hallway." Rose's hands were flat on the table now, pressing into the wood like she needed to feel something solid. "And he told me that if I said anything different, he'd tell people I was involved, that I'd helped you, that I'd let you into his room." She looked at her hands. "I was 16. I didn't know what to do." "But you knew what you saw." "Yes. A beat. I knew exactly what I saw." The fire shifted in the hearth, and the sound of it was the only sound for a moment. "Tell me," Lydia said. "Tell me exactly." So Rose did. She'd been in the hallway because she couldn't with her mother, who was visiting a relative in town and had taken a room for the week. She'd gone to the kitchen for water, and she was coming back when she heard the lock on Lydia's door. She'd stepped back into the shadow near the linen shelf, and she'd watched Wesley Crane come out of that room moving fast, one hand over his face, and she'd seen the blood between his fingers, and she'd seen his expression. Not pain, or not only pain, but something uglier than pain. The look of a man who'd been refused something he considered owed to him. He'd seen her in the hallway. He'd stopped. "He didn't say anything at first," Rose said. "He just looked at me. And then he smiled. The kind of smile that's really a warning. And he said, 'You didn't see me.' Just like that. And I—" Her voice thinned. "I nodded. I just nodded. And he walked away." Lydia put her mug down. Her hands stayed on the table, very still. "The next morning he came to find me before the sheriff arrived," Rose continued. "That's when he offered the money. He made it sound like I had a choice, but it wasn't really a choice. He made sure I understood what the alternative was." "And your mother?" Elias said from the door. Rose looked at him. She never knew. She was sick and we needed the money, and I told myself it would be all right, that someone else would say something, that Lydia would find another way to prove it. She looked back at Lydia. You didn't find another way. No, Lydia said. I didn't. Another silence. Then Lydia said, Why now? What changed? He came back. Rose said it quickly, like ripping something. Crane. He came back to Redstone Crossing 3 weeks ago. He's been at the Broken Spur, talking to people, spending money. And he's asking about you. About where you went after the auction, who bought you, what Mercer's claim on you looks like legally. She looked at Elias when she said the name, like she was checking whether he already knew this. His expression told her nothing. He has a man with him, a lawyer, or someone who looks like one, and another man who doesn't look like anything professional but scares people just by standing still. A bounty hunter, Elias said. People are saying so. I don't know his name, but he came into the general store twice, and both times the owner found reasons to be somewhere else while he was browsing. Lydia had gone very still during this. Not the controlled stillness of someone managing their emotions, something different. The stillness of someone assembling a picture and not liking what it was showing them. He's building a legal claim, she said. That's what the lawyer is for. He's going to try to say the auction was invalid, that Mercer's dollar doesn't constitute legitimate transfer because, what? Because I was county property and the county's claim supersedes. She pressed her lips together. It doesn't work that way, but it doesn't have to actually work. It just has to create enough confusion that a sheriff looks the other way while his man takes me. Elias pushed off the door and came to the table. He sat down in the third chair, the one that was usually empty. What's his end goal? He wants you back under his thumb? He wants to make sure you can never speak publicly about what happened? Both, Lydia said. Neither is enough without the other. She turned her face slightly toward Rose. How did you find us? How did you know where I was? Hatch, Rose said with a kind of grim flatness. He told 3 people at the Broken Spur that he'd auctioned off the Rowan girl to some hermit in the mountains. Elias Mercer, 12 miles northeast. She looked at him again. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you'd want to hear. It's fine, Elias said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man recalibrating. So Crane knows exactly where we are. He knew before I left town. That's why I came. I heard him talking to the lawyer 2 nights ago, going over what they were planning. I couldn't hear everything, but enough. She took a breath. They're coming in the next few days, maybe sooner. The fire was the only sound again, and outside the morning had progressed from pale to bright without anyone in the cabin noticing. Elias looked at Lydia. She was looking at nothing, her eyes on the middle distance, her mind clearly somewhere else, working. We can't stay and wait for them, she said finally. That puts them in control of when and how it happens. Agreed. And we can't run. Running means they chase, and they have more men and better resources for a chase. She put one hand flat on the table. We go to them. Rose blinked. To Redstone Crossing? Yes. That's Lydia. Crane has a lawyer and a hired gun and money and the ear of the saloon crowd. You have... She gestured and seemed to realize mid-gesture that it was inadequate. I have a witness, Lydia said. You. She turned her face toward Rose with the directness that made the girl go very still. Will you say it in public? Everything you just told me. Will you say it where people can hear? Rose opened her mouth, closed it. Her hands on the table pressed harder into the wood. I know what I'm asking, Lydia said. Her voice wasn't gentle exactly, but it wasn't hard either. It was the voice of someone who understands the weight of a thing and isn't pretending otherwise. I know it's not safe. I know Crane will come after you next if you do it. But I also know you didn't come 12 miles up a mountain in this cold because you were planning to keep quiet. A long moment. Rose looked down at her hands. No, she said very quietly. I didn't. Then here's what we're going to do. What followed was 2 hours of planning that Elias led and Lydia refined, and Rose absorbed with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely frightened but has decided to be frightened moving rather than frightened still. They went over what Rose knew, in detail. The names of the people Crane had been talking to, the location of the lawyer, the physical description of the bounty hunter, the layout of the Broken Spur where most of the relevant conversations seemed to be happening. Elias knew the Broken Spur. He knew its owner, a taciturn man named Aldous Webb, who had no particular love for troublemakers of any financial status, and who had thrown out men twice his size for causing problems in his establishment. He also knew the sheriff, whose name was Briggs, and whose relationship with justice was the kind that required the right application of pressure before it functioned properly. "Briggs is not a bad man," Elias said when Lydia asked about him. "He's a careful man, which sometimes amounts to the same thing, but not always. Meaning he can be moved if the weight on the right side gets heavy enough. Meaning he doesn't want to be wrong publicly. If Crane's claim falls apart in front of witnesses, Briggs will come down on the correct side because it'll be the only side left standing." "Then we need witnesses," Lydia said. "Not just Rose. We need people in that room." "Who?" Rose said. "Who in Redstone Crossing did Crane spend his money on? At the Broken Spur, at the general store, anywhere?" Rose thought. "The saloon crowd, some of the men from the feed yard. He bought a round for the house 2 nights running." "And who didn't take the round?" Rose looked surprised by the question. She thought harder. "Mrs. Garfield," she said slowly. "The school teacher. She came in for something. I don't know what, she doesn't drink. And someone tried to hand her a glass and she looked at it like it had personally offended her and left." A pause. "And Aldous Webb didn't drink his. He just set it on the bar and walked to the other end." Elias nodded slowly. "Webb and Garfield," he said. "There are others too, probably. People who don't like what Crane smells like but haven't had a reason to say so." "We give them a reason," Lydia said. They left the cabin that afternoon. There was a brief argument about whether Lydia should stay. Elias raised it once, carefully, and Lydia dismissed it with a precision that suggested she'd anticipated it and had her answer ready. "This is about my life," she said. "Not yours to protect while I wait somewhere safe. I'm going." "I know," he said. "I had to ask." "You didn't have to, but I understand why you did." She was already pulling on her coat. "Don't ask again." He didn't. They took 2 horses, Fletcher and the older mare, whose name was June, and who was not fast but was steady in the way that mattered more than speed on a mountain trail in winter. Rose rode June. Lydia rode with Elias on Fletcher, in front of him as she had on the first day, except that now she knew the feel of the trail by the way the horse moved under her and the sounds of the terrain on either side, and she held herself with a steadiness that was different from that first day. Less braced, more present. They were 2 hours down the mountain when Rose said, from behind them on June, "What if it doesn't work?" "Then we adapt," Elias said. "That's not very reassuring." "No," he agreed. "It isn't," Lydia said without turning around. "It's going to work, Rose, not because everything goes to plan. It won't. It never does. But because the truth of what happened is on our side and you're willing to say it, and that's harder to beat than most people think." Rose was quiet for a moment. "You sound very sure." "I'm not sure at all," Lydia said, "but I've been carrying this for 2 years and I'm done carrying it alone. That part I'm sure about." They came into Redstone Crossing in the late afternoon, when the light was going gold and flat across the frozen square, and the town was doing the particular thing small towns do at that hour. People heading home, the day's business winding down, the saloons starting to fill. Nobody was expecting them. That was deliberate. Elias had thought about where to go first for most of the ride down. Not the Broken Spur. Not yet. Not the sheriff. Not without something more solid in hand than a witness's testimony and a request. The new owner of the Cassidy boarding house first. He'd heard the place had changed hands 8 months back, after old Mrs. Cassidy had died in the fall, and the new owner was a woman named Clara Holt, who'd come up from the South and had a reputation already for not tolerating nonsense in her establishment or her vicinity. He didn't know Clara Holt personally, but Aldous Webb had mentioned her once in a conversation that suggested he respected her, and Webb was not generous with his respect. The boarding house was on Mill Road, just as it had always been, and it looked largely the same from the outside. The same weathered clapboard, the same narrow porch, the same hand-lettered sign. But there was a new coat of paint on the door, dark green, and the window boxes had been cleared and filled with dry sand to discourage ice, which was the kind of practical detail that told you something about the person who'd thought of it. Elias tied Fletcher and June at the post and helped Lydia down, and the 3 of them went up the porch steps and he knocked. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that did a quick, comprehensive inventory of all three of them in about 2 seconds. She looked at Rose first, then at Elias, then at Lydia, and something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but adjusting. "You're Lydia Rowan," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Lydia said. "And you're Clara Holt." "I am." She looked at Elias. "And you're the man who bought her at that ridiculous auction." "Elias Mercer, and it wasn't a—" "I know what it wasn't," Clara said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in, all of you. You look half frozen, and I imagine you have a great deal to tell me." The interior of the boarding house was warm and smelled of supper being made somewhere in the back, and it was cleaner than Elias had expected. Not sterile, but the kind of clean that speaks of genuine standards rather than appearances. Clara Holt led them into a front sitting room and told them to sit, and came back 5 minutes later with coffee and a plate of bread and said, "Now, talk." Lydia talked. Roses filled in what Lydia couldn't know. Elias added what he'd observed. Clara Holt listened to all of it without interrupting once, which Elias found remarkable. Most people interrupted, especially at the parts that surprised them, and several parts of this story were clearly surprising her, though she kept it contained to the movement of her jaw and the set of her hands in her lap. When they were finished, she said, "Wesley Crane." She said it like a word she'd been chewing on for a while. "I've heard his name 6 times since I bought this property, always in the same context, always with the same particular quality of silence that follows it." "What kind of silence?" Rose asked. "The kind that happens when people know something they've decided not to say," Clara said. "I've run establishments before. I know that silence." She looked at Lydia directly. "What happened to you in this house, the version this girl just described? I believe it. I believe it because I know what the other version sounds like. And it sounds like every other story a man like Crane has ever told about a woman who refused him." Lydia's face did something she didn't quite catch in time. Something raw, briefly. She pulled it back, but not before Elias saw it, and not before Clara Holt did either. "What do you need from me?" Clara said. "Your voice," Lydia said. "You're standing in this town, whatever it is, and access to this house. There may be records here, ledgers from Mrs. Cassidy's time, guest registers, correspondence." "I have them," Clara said. "I kept everything when I bought the property. I wasn't sure why at the time." She paused. "I may have been sure, actually. I just didn't know the shape of it yet." She left the room and came back with a wooden box, the kind used for document storage, and set it on the table between them. Lydia put her hands on the edge of it and said, "What's in here?" "Guest ledgers, room assignment records, and some correspondence that the old woman kept separate in an envelope that I haven't fully read through." Clara reached into the box and withdrew the envelope. "It's sealed. I didn't feel I had the right to open it before I understood what I had." Elias took it, turned it over. Written on the front, in a shaky but deliberate hand. "For when someone asks." He showed it to Lydia, described what it said. "Open it," she said. Inside were 3 pages in Mrs. Cassidy's handwriting, old and cramped, but legible. A full account of the night in question, written from what the woman had seen and heard herself, and including the detail that she had heard the lock of Lydia's room being opened from the outside at approximately 11 in the evening, and that she had seen Wesley Crane in the upstairs hallway at that time, and that she had chosen not to come forward because she was afraid of what his money and his temper would do to her business. And underneath that, her acknowledgement that this was a choice she regretted. Written in the same old, cramped hand. "I am a coward. I know it. I'm writing this because I cannot go to my grave having said nothing at all." The room was very quiet. "She knew," Rose said. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "She knew the whole time." "She was afraid," Lydia said. She didn't say it generously or bitterly. She said it the way you say a fact that doesn't resolve cleanly into either forgiveness or blame. People are afraid. It doesn't make the thing right. It just makes it what it was. Clara Holt had her hands folded in her lap with the tightness of someone trying not to let go of something. "I'll stand with you," she said. "Tomorrow, wherever this happens. Whatever you need me to say in public, I'll say it. I knew that woman for 6 months before she died, and she was not a villain, but she made a wrong choice, and she knew it. And this—" She touched the edge of the papers without picking them up. "This deserves to see light." Elias had been thinking while they read, turning the situation over the way he turned difficult terrain over, looking for the angles that weren't obvious, the places where the footing wasn't as solid as it looked. "We need to control where this happens," he said. "Not in the Broken Spur. Crane has that room. Not in the sheriff's office. Briggs can shut it down by claiming jurisdiction." "The square," Lydia said. "The square," he agreed. "Public ground. Nobody's territory. And we need enough people there that it can't be quietly managed afterward." "Webb," Rose said. "If Aldous Webb comes, people will pay attention. He doesn't go places without a reason." "I'll speak to Webb tonight," Elias said. "And Mrs. Garfield." "I'll go with you," Lydia said. "Lydia, I know the risks." Her voice had the flat certainty of someone who'd already had the internal argument and won it. "And if Crane's people see me walking around this town tonight, in the open, not hiding, not running, that changes something. It changes the story he's been telling about what I am." She was right. He hated that she was right. A little, because right meant she was going to be in the open in a town where a hired gun was currently drinking and waiting. But she was right. "Stay close," he said. "As close as you'll let me," she said, which wasn't quite a concession, but was as near to one as she made. They went to Aldous Webb first, the back entrance to the Broken Spur, at Elias's insistence, because walking Lydia through the front door with Crane's man inside was a provocation he wasn't ready to make yet. Webb met them in the storeroom off the kitchen, a low-ceilinged space that smelled of sawdust and whiskey and old wood, and he listened to Elias with the particular stillness of a man who has spent 20 years behind a bar and has therefore heard most things and is rarely genuinely surprised. Then Elias finished, and Webb was quiet, and then he said, "The man Crane brought, the one people are staying away from." "Yes. His name is Dodd. I don't know his first name, and I don't think he uses it. He's been in twice, and he drank water both times, which is the thing about him that worries me most." Webb crossed his arms. "A man who comes to a saloon and drinks water is either very disciplined or very focused. Dodd is both." "You'll come tomorrow?" Elias said. "I'll be there." Webb looked at Lydia, who was standing just behind Elias's right shoulder. "Miss Rowan? I heard what they said about you 2 years ago. I didn't know you personally, so I let it stay where people put it." He paused. "I should have thought harder about that. I'm sorry for it." Lydia turned toward his voice. "You're coming tomorrow," she said. "That's enough." Mrs. Garfield was harder. She answered her door with the expression of a woman who was accustomed to people wanting things from her, and who had developed a sophisticated system for determining which requests deserved engagement and which deserved a closed door. Elias told her what he needed. She looked at him over her spectacles for a long moment, and then she looked at Lydia and said, "I was at that auction. I want you to know I was not there to participate in it. I went because I thought, I don't know what I thought, that my presence would make it more civilized, somehow, which was foolish." "It was," Lydia agreed, "but you're here now." The schoolteacher blinked. "Yes, I am." A pause. "I'll be in the square, and I'll bring my students' parents. I taught half this town's children. When I tell them to come to the square, they come." Outside, on the dark and frozen street, Elias exhaled slowly. Rose was back at the boarding house with Clara. It was just him and Lydia on the cold street, and the night had the particular depth of winter nights in high country, cloudless and cold enough that the stars looked sharp and close. "Tomorrow," Lydia said. "Tomorrow." She was quiet for a moment, then, "He'll be there, Crane, with his lawyer and his documents and his hired man. Yes, and it could go wrong. It could." She turned her face toward him, not looking, not the way a sighted person looks, but that orientation she had, that way of directing her whole attention at something and making you feel it. "I need you to promise me something." "Depends on the promise." "If it goes wrong, if Dodd makes a move or the lawyer pulls something we haven't anticipated, don't react to them first. React to me. Follow my lead." She paused. "I know that goes against every instinct you have." He thought about it honestly, which she deserved. "You're right, it does." "I know, but this is my life they took from me. I want to be the one standing in front of it when we take it back." Her voice didn't waver. "Can you do that?" The cold settled around them. Somewhere down the street, the warm light of the Broken Spur spilled under its door, and the sound of voices drifted out. And somewhere in that building, a man named Dodd was drinking water and waiting for a job he'd been paid to do. Yes, Elias said. She nodded once, and they walked back to the boarding house through the dark of Redstone Crossing, and neither of them spoke again that night, because there wasn't anything left to say that the morning wouldn't have to answer for itself. What Elias didn't tell her, what he kept close and did not share because she hadn't asked, and he didn't want to put it on her, was what he'd seen when they were leaving Webb's back entrance. A figure just at the edge of the alley's reach of lamplight, standing still, watching, not moving, just watching. The way a man watches something he's been paid to watch. Dodd. Elias had met his eyes for just a moment, 1 second, maybe 2, and what he'd read there was nothing personal and nothing emotional, just assessment. The particular professional quality of a man who was measuring a problem and finding it manageable. Elias had walked on without changing his pace. He was good at that. He'd learned it a long time ago in country a great deal more dangerous than this, but his hand had stayed close to his coat the rest of the way back, and he'd slept that night with the same lightness he'd slept with since the note appeared under the door. And when he woke before dawn and lay in the narrow bed in Clara Holt's spare room, listening to the house, he was already running through tomorrow, turn by turn, the way you run through dangerous terrain before you walk it, looking for where the ground gives, looking for where you'll need to be solid, looking for the 1 or 2 moments where everything either holds together or comes apart. The morning came cold and clear and absolute, the way mornings do in that country when they want to remind you that the world doesn't adjust itself to what you need from it. Lydia was already awake when he got up. He could hear her in the kitchen with Clara, their voices low, the smell of coffee reaching all the way to the back room. He dressed. He checked his rifle. He put the revolver in his coat pocket, not his holster, more accessible, less visible. He thought about the look in Dodd's eyes in the alley. Nothing personal, nothing emotional, just a job. He walked into the kitchen. Lydia turned at the sound of his step, and whatever she read in the quality of it, she said simply, "Are you ready?" He looked at her, at the set of her shoulders, at the way she was holding her coffee with both hands like it was something to be held on to, at the particular composure of a woman who was terrified and had chosen to be terrified walking forward rather than terrified standing still. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" She set her coffee down. "I've been ready for 2 years," she said. "I just didn't have anywhere to put it until now." The square was empty when they arrived, which was what Elias had wanted. He'd asked Webb and Mrs. Garfield to spread the word quietly. Not announcement, not invitation, just the kind of information that moves through a small town the way water moves through soil, finding every crack and settling into it. Come to the square at 10. Something's happening. Something you ought to see. He didn't know how many people would come. He knew how many he needed. Enough that whatever happened couldn't be quietly buried afterward. Enough that Briggs would feel the weight of witnesses pressing against whatever arrangement Crane had made with him. Enough that the story the town had been carrying for 2 years would have to make room for another version of itself. Clara Holt walked with them from the boarding house. She carried the wooden box with Mrs. Cassidy's letters under her arm, with the purposeful steadiness of someone carrying something breakable and important. Rose walked on Lydia's other side, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, which seemed to be the arrangement that felt safest to both of them. Lydia walked in the middle of this small group with her hand on Elias's arm. Not the tentative touch of someone being led, but the firm, directional grip of someone who had learned to read terrain through the person beside her. She'd told him once, in the cabin, that a person's arm told you more than a cane, because a cane only told you about the ground, but a person told you about the ground and everything that was moving on it. He thought about that now, and tried to walk in a way that told her something useful. They reached the square at 9:45. The lamppost threw its pale morning light across the packed snow and the frozen ridges in the ground, and the square was empty except for an old dog belonging to nobody in particular who was sleeping against the base of the post and didn't stir when they arrived. Then within 10 minutes, people began to come. Not in a rush, not the way a crowd gathers for something exciting. 1 or 2 at a time, the way people come to things they're not entirely sure about but feel compelled to attend, with the slightly sideways approach of those who want to be present without committing too early to a visible position. The blacksmith. Two women from the south end of town who did laundry together and were rarely seen apart. The man who owned the feed yard, who stood with his arms crossed and his expression neutral. Three of the fathers whose children sat in Mrs. Garfield's classroom. Mrs. Garfield herself arrived at 5 to 10 with the school teacher's absolute reliability and stood near the front with her arms folded and her expression the same one she'd shown Elias at her door. Not warm, but attentive, which was what mattered. Aldous Webb came last, from the direction of the broken spur, moving with the particular deliberate pace of a man who is making a statement by being somewhere. Several people noticed him and their expressions shifted, something settling in them, a small relaxation of uncertainty, as though his presence confirmed that this was real and worth attending to. By 10 o'clock there were perhaps 30 people in the square. And then, from the direction of the hotel, Redstone Crossing had acquired a small one in the past year, 2 stories and 6 rooms, and a proprietor named Fitch, who overcharged for everything. Wesley Crane arrived. Elias had built a picture of the man from what Lydia had told him and what Rose had described, and the general shape of what he understood about men who operated the way Crane operated. The reality was both more and less than the picture. He was maybe 45, well-dressed in the way that announces money without quite achieving elegance, with a broad face and the kind of confident posture that came from never having been significantly wrong in any room he'd entered. He had a lawyer beside him, a small, precise man in a gray coat who moved like someone who spent his life reading documents and had the permanently squinting expression of a man translating everything in front of him into legal language before deciding what to think about it. And behind both of them, a step back and slightly to the right, was Dodd. In daylight, he was exactly what Webb had described, and exactly what Elias had read in the alley the night before. Average height, heavy through the shoulders, nothing notable about his clothing, which was the point. The kind of man whose most significant feature was the quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved across the square the moment he walked into it, cataloging people and positions with the unhurried efficiency of long practice. They found Elias within the first 3 seconds. Elias held the look and then let it go, because he'd promised Lydia he'd follow her lead, and her lead right now was standing straight and still and directing her attention toward the sound of Crane's footsteps as he crossed the frozen ground. Crane stopped about 15 feet away. He looked at Lydia with the particular expression of a man who has spent time rehearsing a version of this moment in his mind and is now finding the reality somewhat different from the rehearsal. "Well," he said. His voice had a practiced quality, the warmth of someone who performs reasonableness rather than feeling it. "Miss Rowan, somebody told me you'd come back to town. I wasn't sure I believed it." Lydia said nothing. She just turned her face toward him in that way she had, the precise, attentive orientation that some people found unnerving because it had the quality of actually seeing, even when it wasn't. The silence lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Crane filled it the way men like him always do, by moving past the discomfort as though it had been planned. "I don't have any quarrel with you personally," he said. "I think there was a misunderstanding 2 years ago that got out of hand. That's what I'd like to address, if you're willing." He gestured at the lawyer, who produced a folded document from his coat with the prompt efficiency of someone who had been holding it ready. "I've had a legal review of the county auction, and there are some questions about its validity that I think—" "There are no questions," Lydia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but the square was quiet enough that it carried, and the 30 people standing in it heard it, and a couple of them shifted their weight the way people do when the actual thing begins. "Miss Rowan, the auction was conducted by the county. A legal bid was made and accepted. There's nothing irregular about it." She paused. "You didn't come here about the auction." Crane's expression didn't change, exactly, but something behind it did. A subtle tightening, like a hand closing. "I came here to resolve a situation that I believe was mishandled." "You came here to silence me," Lydia said. "You came here because I'm still alive and still free and still capable of saying what happened in that boarding house 2 years ago, and that concerns you. Everything else is paperwork." Someone in the crowd made a sound. Not quite a response, more an involuntary acknowledgement, the kind a body makes when something lands with weight. The lawyer stepped forward. He was the kind of man who used his smallness as a weapon. Got close, spoke precisely, made people feel that the conversation had been removed from human scale and translated into a language only he spoke fluently. Mr. Crane's position is that the nature of the original complaint against you was never properly adjudicated, and that the subsequent county determination— Do you want to tell him, Lydia said to the square in general, or should I wait? A beat. And then Rose stepped forward. She was shaking. Elias could see it from where he stood. Her hands at her sides, visibly unsteady, her face pale with cold, and with the specific fear of someone who has been carrying a secret so long that releasing it feels like stepping off a ledge. She stepped up beside Lydia and faced the crowd, and she faced Crane, and she opened her mouth. "My name is Rose Bennett," she said. Her voice shook on the first word and then steadied itself, imperfectly but sufficiently, on the rest. "I was staying at the Cassidy boarding house 2 years ago. I was in the hallway the night Wesley Crane came out of Lydia Rowan's room. I saw him. I saw his face. I saw what he looked like." She stopped, made herself continue. "He threatened me afterward. He paid me $20 to tell the sheriff I hadn't seen anything. I took the money. I should not have taken the money, and I should not have stayed quiet, and I am telling you now what I should have told you then." The square was absolutely silent. Crane turned toward Rose with an expression that had dropped the performed reasonableness entirely. What was underneath it was plainer and uglier. "That's a very serious claim," he said, in a voice that was still controlled but had lost its warmth. "And it's also a lie, and I'll be speaking to my attorney about—" "There's more," Clara Holt said. She had opened the wooden box. She was holding the pages from Mrs. Cassidy's envelope, and her voice, when she spoke, had the carrying quality of a woman who had run establishments and managed people and did not raise her voice because she didn't need to. She read. Not all of it. She was precise about what mattered and left out what didn't. But the central facts in Mrs. Cassidy's own hand, in the old woman's final written testimony to herself. The sound of the lock. Crane in the hallway, her choice not to speak, her knowledge that the choice was wrong. When Clara finished, she lowered the pages and looked at Crane with the expression of a woman who has been waiting to do something and has now done it. "This was written by the woman who owned that house for 30 years, Clara said. "Written and sealed and marked for when someone asks. Someone is asking." Crane looked at his lawyer. The lawyer was still holding the folded document, but with less certainty than before. His hands had shifted slightly, the document drooping at one end, like something whose purpose has been partially undermined. "None of this is legally admissible as anything," the lawyer said. He said it to the square, not just to Crane, which told Elias that the man was experienced enough to know when he was performing for an audience rather than conducting a proceeding. A sealed letter from a deceased woman with no witnesses to its composition. "This isn't a courtroom," Aldous Webb said. He said it from where he was standing, near the back of the crowd, and he said it with the flat simplicity of a man stating an obvious fact, and the crowd turned toward him and something shifted in the collective temperature of the square. A degree or two warmer and a degree or two more certain. "This is a public square," Webb continued. "These are people who live in this town, and what they've just heard is the statement of a woman who was present and another woman who wrote down what she knew before she died. You want to argue admissibility? Go find a courtroom." He looked at Crane. "This is a different kind of reckoning." Crane turned toward him. The performance had fully fallen away now, and what was left was the man underneath. Not dramatically villainous, which was somehow worse, but simply transactional, cold, calculating the options. "Dodd," he said. It was a single word, said quietly, and it might have meant nothing, but Dodd moved when he said it, a single step forward, a small repositioning that nonetheless changed the geometry of the square, and Elias was already moving before he'd finished processing the decision to move. He put himself between Dodd and Lydia. Not dramatically. He didn't draw anything, didn't raise his voice, didn't make it a performance. He just moved into the space and stood in it, and looked at Dodd, and said quietly enough that it was between the two of them, "Don't." Dodd looked at him with the same assessment he'd shown in the alley, calculating, measuring. He was good. Elias could see that, read it in the way the man held himself, the economy of his posture, the absence of anything wasted. He was better at this than most of the men Elias had faced in the rougher years. But he was also a professional, and professionals understand context, and the context right now was 30 people in a square in a crowd that had shifted from uncertain to something harder, and a hired job that had been predicated on a version of this situation that was no longer the version that existed. Dodd held Elias's look for 3 full seconds. Then he stepped back. Not retreat. He was too experienced for it to look like retreat. Just a recalibration. A professional acknowledgement that the field had changed. Crane saw it. Whatever calculation he'd been running behind his eyes, Dodd's step back interrupted it. And for the first time since he'd walked into the square, he looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he hadn't fully planned for. Sheriff Briggs appeared at the edge of the square. He'd been there for a while, Elias suspected, long enough to have heard most of what had been said, which was what Elias had hoped for when he'd sent Webb to mention the gathering to the deputy the previous evening. Briggs was a careful man. He would not have stayed away from something happening in his own town square, and he would not have come in early because coming in early meant choosing a side before the weight of the thing was clear. Now the weight was clear. Briggs walked to the center of the square with the deliberate step of a man who is making a public decision in real time and knows everyone is watching him make it. I was perhaps 55, with a gray mustache and a sheriff's star that caught the pale winter light. And he looked at Crane and then at Lydia and then at the papers in Clara's hands. And then he said, "I'd like to see those letters." Clara handed them to him without a word. He read. The square held its breath, not as a dramatic gesture, but as the involuntary response of a group of people watching something that might actually matter get decided. Elias watched Briggs's face, not the papers. Briggs's face went through several things in the course of reading, some version of recognition, some version of discomfort, and finally a settling. The expression of a man who has found that the uncomfortable truth and the path of least resistance have aligned, which only happens occasionally, but when it does, tends to produce results. Briggs folded the papers and held them, and looked at Crane. "Mr. Crane," he said, "I conducted the investigation 2 years ago into the complaint against Miss Rowan. I want to say, publicly, in front of these people, that I believe that investigation was incomplete." He said it with the careful phrasing of a man who is admitting something without fully characterizing his own role in it, which Elias noted and filed away as the kind of partial accountability that was frustrating but was also, probably, the best that was going to be achieved today. "In light of what's been presented here this morning, I am not prepared to act on any legal claim brought by Mr. Crane regarding Miss Rowan's custody or status." The lawyer's document, Elias observed, was now fully drooping in the man's hands. The lawyer himself had the expression of someone who would like to be somewhere else. Furthermore, Briggs said, and here he seemed to make a decision of his own, separate from the one that had been made for him by the evidence, "I will be reviewing the original file, and I would suggest that Mr. Crane and his associates make themselves available for questions at my office this afternoon." Crane said nothing for a long moment. He stood in the winter light of the square with the crowd around him, and the evidence on the table and the sheriff between him and whatever he'd come here to do, and he went through something internal that Elias wasn't able to fully read, but that ended in a stillness that wasn't calm. It was the stillness of something that has stopped moving, not because it wants to, but because it has run out of room. "This isn't finished," Crane said. He said it quietly, and he said it to Lydia specifically, not to the crowd. "Yes, it is," Lydia said. She said it simply, not triumphant, not angry, just certain, the way you're certain about things that have been decided. Crane looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back toward the hotel, and the lawyer followed him, and Dodd followed the lawyer, and the crowd in the square parted for them, and then closed again in their wake like water. Briggs turned to Elias. "I'm going to need the original auction documentation. Hatch has it. I know Hatch has it. I'll get it from Hatch." He paused. "Mercer, I want you to understand that what happened here today that there are still legal questions about the nature of the auction itself, and about Miss Rowan's formal—" "Sheriff," Clara Holt said from beside him, "what Miss Rowan needs today is a formal statement from your office that there is no outstanding complaint against her, no active county claim on her person, and no legal basis for anyone to bring one. Can you provide that?" Briggs looked at Clara Holt with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the most formidable person in this square was not who he'd been watching. "I can have something drawn up by end of day," he said. "End of morning," Clara said. A beat. "End of morning," Briggs agreed. He walked toward his office. Clara Holt watched him go and then turned back to the box and the papers and began returning them with the focused practicality of someone whose work is not finished simply because the dramatic portion of it has ended. Rose was standing very still beside Lydia. The shaking had stopped. She had the look of someone who has put down something heavy and is still adjusting to the absence of it, not quite sure yet whether to feel lighter or hollow or something in between. "Are you all right?" Lydia asked her. She'd turned toward the quality of Rose's breathing, which was still uneven. "I don't know," Rose said. "I think so." She paused. Is it? "It's done," Lydia said. "The part that was yours to do. It's done." Rose made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. "I thought I was going to be sick when he looked at me." "You weren't." "No, but I thought I was." "That's what courage is," Lydia said. "It's not being afraid, it's being afraid and speaking anyway." Rose wiped her face with the back of her hand. Around them, the crowd was breaking up in the gradual, thoughtful way of people who have witnessed something that requires some private processing before it can become a story they tell. A few people lingered. The blacksmith spoke briefly to Webb, and two of the laundry women approached Clara and asked to see the letter, which Clara permitted with the stipulation that they didn't handle it. Mrs. Garfield approached Lydia directly. She stood in front of her with the formal posture she used for everything and said, "Miss Rowan, I owe you an apology. I was at that auction and I said nothing, and I have thought about it regularly since." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "Did you know about Crane? About what happened at the boarding house?" "I had heard a version, the version that spread." Mrs. Garfield's voice was careful. "I did not investigate its accuracy. I accepted what was available, and what was available was his version, and that was a failure of judgment on my part." "Yes," Lydia said. "It was." Mrs. Garfield absorbed this without flinching. "I will do better with what comes next, if there is anything I can do." "There may be," Lydia said. "I'll let you know." The schoolteacher nodded, once, and left. Elias had been standing slightly apart during these exchanges, giving Lydia the room she needed to conduct them on her own terms, which he'd understood instinctively was what she needed. He was watching the direction Crane had gone, the hotel. Its second-floor windows, one of which had a curtain that wasn't quite still. Webb appeared at his elbow. "Dodd's going to be the problem," Webb said, in the quiet tone of two men having a private conversation at the edge of a public event. "I know. He got paid for a job that didn't get done. That's a professional problem for a man like him. He'll move on." Webb was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. Or he'll try to salvage what he can. Not here. Not in the square. Somewhere with fewer eyes." "Then we don't give him somewhere with fewer eyes." Elias looked at the hotel window. The curtain had stilled. "We stay visible. We pick up the documentation from Briggs in person, and we do it in the middle of the day on the main street. We have supper at your establishment, if you'll have us." Webb considered this. "I'll have you. Clara Holt too?" "Clara Holt too." "And the girl?" "And Rose. Yes." Webb nodded slowly. "All right. That keeps it complicated for him through tonight, at least." He paused. After tonight, Crane's claim is dead on paper and Dodd's employer is legally compromised. At that point, finishing the job is a liability, not a paycheck. You're assuming Dodd is rational." "Men who drink water in saloons are rational," Elias said. "That's the only reassuring thing I know about him." Webb almost smiled. He walked back toward the broken spur, and Elias turned back to the small group remaining in the square. Lydia was standing with Rose and Clara, and the conversation between the three women had changed. It had lost the urgent quality of the past hours and taken on something quieter, something that looked from the outside like the particular relief of people who have been in a storm and are still wet but can see that the weather has changed. Clara was asking Rose something about her mother, and Rose was answering, and Lydia was listening with her face turned slightly upward in the cold air. Elias stood and watched them for a moment before he walked over. He noticed, not for the first time and not without some discomfort, that the thing he felt watching Lydia was not the same thing he'd felt in the first days. The scout's assessment, the practical evaluation of capability and risk. It was something more inconvenient than that, something he didn't have a clean word for and wasn't ready to examine in full. He walked over anyway. "Briggs will have the paperwork by mid-morning," he said. "We'll go together to pick it up." Lydia turned toward him. "All right." She paused. "You moved when Dodd moved." "I did. I told you to follow my lead." "You also have the revolver on a hook in the boarding house bedroom instead of on your person," he said. which meant that if Dodd had continued moving, your lead would have had a 10-second gap in it. A pause. Fair point. I'll make sure to tell you when I'm overriding your lead and why, so you can make the call. She seemed to turn this over. Yes, that's acceptable. Good. She almost said something else, and then didn't, and instead turned her face back toward the cold air with the expression he'd been seeing more and more. Not the controlled blankness of the first days, not the rigid composure of someone managing fear, but something more open than either of those. Something that looked, if you were paying attention, like a person beginning to trust the ground under her feet. They went to Briggs's office at 10:30. The paperwork was ready. Briggs had worked fast, which Elias suspected was as much about being on the right side of the thing in print as it was about efficiency. The document was plain and unglamorous. A formal statement that the county held no outstanding claims against Lydia Rowan, that the original investigation of 2 years prior had been found insufficient, and that no legal basis existed for any third party to bring a claim of custody or ownership. Briggs handed it to Elias, who handed it to Lydia, who held it between her hands for a moment without speaking. "Can you read me what it says?" she asked. Not with difficulty, just directly, as she always asked for things she needed. He read it to her. All of it, every careful bureaucratic word. When he finished, she lowered the paper and held it in one hand at her side, and she didn't say anything for a moment. And then she said quietly, 2 years. Yes. For a piece of paper that took Briggs an hour to write. Yes. She breathed in slowly and out again. All right, she said, then let's go have supper. The afternoon passed in the deliberate visibility that Elias had planned, the four of them together on the main street and then at the Broken Spur, which was populated enough by early evening that Dodd's presence would have made a statement he clearly wasn't willing to make. He didn't appear. Crane's lawyer checked out of the hotel at 3 in the afternoon, according to Fitch, the proprietor, who mentioned it to Clara Holt, who mentioned it to Elias, who noted it and continued eating. By evening, Crane himself had gone. Fitch wasn't certain of the exact time, but the room was cleared and the bill was paid and the man was gone, and whether he'd gone back to Millhaven or somewhere else was not information Fitch had or was inclined to speculate about. Dodd was the last uncertainty. He wasn't at the hotel, wasn't at the saloon, wasn't anywhere that any of Elias's available eyes could place him, which was either because he'd left or because he was being careful about where he was seen, and the difference between those two things mattered. They stayed that night at Clara's boarding house, and Elias took the room nearest the front door and slept with the rifle in both ears and the accumulated alertness of a man who has spent enough years being careful that the habit has become indistinguishable from his natural state. Nothing happened. No sound outside the windows. No movement on the street. Just the cold and the dark and the particular stillness of a frontier town at 3 in the morning when the fire has died down and the wind has dropped and all the people in it are, for the moment, exactly where they should be. In the morning, when he went outside before dawn to check the perimeter out of habit, he found a single set of boot prints in the snow near the corner of the building, facing outward. Someone had stood there for some time, looking at the street. Then they'd walked away, heading south toward the Millhaven Road. Elias stood and looked at those prints for a while. Then he went back inside and made coffee, and didn't mention it because there was nothing to do about what was already done. And the morning had other things in it that deserved more attention than the last evidence of a man who had looked at the situation and walked away. At breakfast, Rose said she was going to stay in Redstone Crossing. She said it with the slightly surprised expression of someone who has discovered a decision in herself that she wasn't expecting. Clara had offered her a position at the boarding house. Not charity, Clara was precise about that, but actual work, laundry, and kitchen work, and the kind of practical management that Clara said she could use another pair of hands for. Rose had thought about it overnight and said yes. Lydia listened to this and then reached across the table and found Rose's hand and held it for a moment. She didn't say anything. Rose seemed to understand that the gesture was the thing. Clara walked them to the horses when it was time to go. She held the wooden box with Mrs. Cassidy's letters, and she said, "I'll keep these, for the record." "Yes," Lydia said. "Keep them." Clara looked at both of them, at Elias, briefly, with the evaluating expression she used for most things, and then at Lydia, longer, with something that was less evaluation and more recognition. You did something difficult, she said. Both of you, but you especially. I want you to know that what you did here will stay. Not everyone in this town deserves to carry it forward properly, but enough of them do. Lydia put her hand out, and Clara shook it with both of hers, firmly, the way people who don't know each other well but recognize something important in each other sometimes do. Elias boosted Lydia up onto Fletcher and swung up behind her and picked up the reins. The morning was clear, the way it had been clear the day they'd ridden down from the mountain, and the Redstone Crossing Square was mostly empty at this hour, and the lamppost threw its inadequate yellow light over nothing in particular. "Ready?" Elias said. Lydia settled in front of him. She had the document folded inside her coat, against her chest. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there by the way she was sitting, the particular straightness of someone carrying something that's been a long time coming. "Yes," she said. "Take me home." He put Fletcher toward the northeast road, and the mountain rose ahead of them in the cold morning air, and behind them Redstone Crossing began its day with the slow, ordinary sounds of a town that had seen something happen in its square, and would be talking about it, and disagreeing about it, and gradually incorporating it into the version of itself it told to newcomers, for a long time to come. Whether it told it correctly was not something either of them would be around to manage. But it had happened, in front of witnesses, on public ground, and whatever Wesley Crane said about it afterward, from wherever he went, would have to contend with that. The ride back up the mountain took longer than the ride down had, which was always the way of it. Descending into trouble moved faster than climbing out of it. Fletcher picked his way up the trail with the patient, ground-eating stride of a horse that knew this path, and Lydia sat in front of Elias without speaking for the first hour, which he understood was not emptiness but the opposite of it. She was full of something that needed time to settle before it could be sorted. He gave her the time. The mountain received them the way it always did, indifferently, which was its own kind of honesty. The pines closed in on either side of the trail, the air grew thinner and colder with every 100 feet of elevation, and the sounds of Redstone Crossing fell away behind them until there was nothing left of it but the occasional distant crow and the creak of leather and the rhythmic compression of hooves in snow. Halfway up, Lydia said, "My hands are cold." He reached around her and covered both her hands with one of his, briefly, and she didn't pull away, and after a moment he went back to the reins. Neither of them commented on it. Near the top, where the trail curved around the east face and the cabin came into view in the afternoon light, low and dark and exactly as they'd left it, smoke-free and still, Lydia said, "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "What happens now?" She said it plainly, without inflection that would tell him which direction she wanted the answer to go. "With the cabin, with this arrangement, I have the document in my coat that says no one can claim me, which means I'm not your responsibility anymore, legally." "You were never my responsibility legally," he said. "That's not what the dollar was for." "I know what the dollar was for." A pause. "I'm asking what comes next. For you and me specifically, in this specific place. Because I need to know what I'm building toward, and I can't build toward something I don't know the shape of." He was quiet for a moment, working out how to say what he wanted to say without making it into something she'd have to manage or accommodate or reassure him about. She deserved a direct answer. She was a direct person, underneath all the careful layers, and directness was what she'd respond to honestly. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as an arrangement, not as something that needs a legal document, because the cabin is better with you in it, and I am too, and I think you know that." The trail leveled out into the clearing. Fletcher slowed to a walk. "I do know that," Lydia said. "I wanted to hear you say it." "I've said it." "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. "I'm not easy to live with. I need things explained a certain way, and I get frustrated when they're not, and I don't always say when I'm struggling because I'm not good at asking for help. And sometimes I go very quiet for long stretches, and it's not about you, but it probably looks like it is." "I know," he said. "You don't know yet. You know some of it." "Then I'll learn the rest." She turned her face slightly, that orientation toward him, and whatever she was reading in the quality of his voice seemed to satisfy something she'd been checking. "All right," she said, "then I'll stay." He helped her down from Fletcher at the porch and led the horse to the lean-to, and by the time he came back inside, Lydia had the cook stove going and was measuring coffee with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned the kitchen so thoroughly it required no more thought than walking. He built the fire up in the hearth, and the cabin filled with warmth, and the afternoon light through the single south-facing window moved across the floor in the way it had moved every afternoon since he'd built the place, and somehow it looked different than it had before. He couldn't have explained why exactly. The light was the same, the floor was the same, but the way a space looks changes when you know the person in it is going to remain in it, and that was the only explanation he had for it. They didn't talk much that evening. They ate, and he read aloud from one of the 3 books he'd gone back to the general store to buy in Redstone Crossing. He'd done it quietly, without telling Lydia, and brought them back in his saddlebag, and when he set them on the table, she'd run her fingers over the spines and said, "What are they?" And he'd told her, and she'd said, "Read the middle one first." And so he did. It was a collection of essays by someone he hadn't heard of, dense and occasionally pretentious. And he stumbled over some of the words, and she corrected him twice with the mild patience of someone who'd had these words read aloud to her before, and neither of them made a thing of it. They went to their separate rooms at the same hour they always did, and the cabin settled into its nighttime sounds. The fire dying, the wind moving through the pines, the occasional shift of the animals in the lean-to, and Elias lay in the dark for a while and thought about the day and the 2 weeks before it and what had accumulated in that time, and then he slept better than he had in years. The weeks that followed were not easy, and they were not simple, and several things about them were hard in ways that had nothing to do with Crane or Dodd or the sheriff or any of the external machinery of threat that had occupied them for so long. The threat being gone was its own kind of adjustment. When there is something coming at you, all your attention organizes itself around it. Every decision, every precaution, every conversation carries the weight of the thing you're preparing for. When it stops, the attention has nowhere to go, and it tends to turn inward, which is where most of the actual difficult terrain lives. Lydia went through a week of something he couldn't name. Not depression exactly, but a flatness, a withdrawal into herself that he recognized as the aftermath of sustained fear and sustained effort. She cooked, and she walked the property, and she did the things she'd built into her days, but she was somewhere behind herself doing it, some necessary part of her absent and resting. He didn't try to fix it. He'd learned enough about her by then to know that attempts to fix the things she was privately working through were not received as help. He just stayed present in the way he knew how. In the room, doing his own work, available without pressing. He read in the evenings whether she wanted him to or not, and after 3 days of quiet, she started listening again. And after 5, she corrected his pronunciation of a word, and after 7, she was back, fully, in the way he'd come to recognize as herself. She never explained what those days had been, and he never asked. What she did, a week after they'd come back from Redstone Crossing, was sit down across from him at the table and say, "I want to talk about what I'm going to do here, not just in the cabin, on the land." "Go ahead," he said. "You said 40 acres cleared. What are you using it for?" "Trapping. Some kitchen garden in summer, the animals." "That's not 40 acres worth of use." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." "What grew here before?" "Some wild herbs on the south slope. I've seen wild onion and what I think is yarrow. The soil on the east side is good. It drains well. I grew potatoes last summer, but not much else." She was listening with the focused attention she brought to plans, building the picture of it, laying out what she knew against what she needed to know. "I can't garden the way a sighted person gardens," she said, "but I can garden a different way. If things are planted in an order, I can learn and maintain. If the rows are marked with something I can feel, rope lines, stakes." She paused. "It would take a full spring to set up properly, but if we did it right, by summer we'd be growing enough to not be dependent on the general store for half of what we eat." "That's a significant project." "I know. I'm not asking if it's significant. I'm asking if you're willing to do it with me." He looked at her across the table. She was serious and practical, and already 3 steps ahead into the logistics of a thing she'd been clearly thinking about for some time. "Yes," he said. "Good." She put her hands flat on the table. "I also want a dog." He blinked. "A dog. A large one. Something that will tell me when someone is at the edge of the property before they get close enough to matter." She said it without self-consciousness, which was one of the things about her that consistently surprised him. The directness with which she identified what she needed and asked for it, without performing helplessness or independence in either direction. I've been thinking about it since before we went to town. We were lucky that Rose came to us on the trail. If she'd come any other way, I wouldn't have known until she was at the door. There's a man in Millhaven who breeds working dogs, Elias said. I know him a little. In spring, when the trail is passable, I can get down there. I'd like to come. To Millhaven. Yes. A beat. I know it's where Crane is, or was. That's not why I want to come. I want to come because it's a trip, and I'd rather be on it than waiting here. He thought about Millhaven and Crane and whether that was still a live concern. He'd been turning it over at intervals since they'd come back. Crane had left Redstone Crossing with his claim in ruins and his hired man's job incomplete and a public record of what he'd done 2 years ago, now existing in a courthouse ledger. Men like Crane didn't absorb that kind of loss cleanly. They found other angles, other approaches, other ways to reassert control over situations that had refused to be controlled. But they also made calculations. And the calculation on Lydia Rowan now included a documented witness, a dead woman's testimony, a sheriff who'd publicly acknowledged investigative failure, and a man who'd demonstrated willingness to put himself between Dodd and a crowd without flinching. The calculus had changed, not permanently, not with absolute certainty, but enough that coming back at her was a significantly worse bet than it had been. We'll go to Millhaven in spring, he said, together. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to whatever she'd been doing before the conversation, which was sorting the tin canisters on the kitchen shelf into an order that made more sense to her than the one he'd used for 3 years. He watched her for a moment, the efficient movement of her hands, the way she tilted her head slightly when she was checking something by weight rather than sight, the small, unconscious sounds she made when the thing she was doing was working. He went back to his work too. Winter finished itself in the slow, reluctant way of mountain winters, not all at once, but in stages, each week slightly less brutal than the last, the cold releasing its grip on things 1 degree at a time, the light lasting a few minutes longer each day, the snow on the south slope starting to show patches of bare earth that grew daily larger. Letters came up from Redstone Crossing twice, carried by a trapper Elias knew who made the mountain run every few weeks. The first was from Clara Holt, businesslike and warm, in the specific combination Clara seemed to manage effortlessly, reporting that Rose had settled into the boarding house work with a willingness that Clara found encouraging, and that the town was talking about what had happened in the square in a way that was, on balance, more honest than not. She didn't editorialize about Crane. She simply noted that he had not returned, and that his name came up less frequently than it had the week after, which she considered a reasonable sign. The second letter was from Rose herself, written in the slightly formal hand of someone who'd been taught penmanship carefully and still used it. It was longer than Clara's and less organized, which made it more Rose. She described the boarding house and the other residents and a cat that had appeared at the kitchen door and been admitted on a provisional basis. She described a conversation she'd had with Mrs. Garfield, in which the schoolteacher had told her that she'd done a brave thing in the square and that bravery wasn't something you were born with or you weren't. It was something you practiced until it was available when you needed it. Rose said she hadn't known what to do with that at the time, but that she'd been thinking about it since. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "Please tell Lydia I think about that morning often, not the bad parts. The part at the end, when she held my hand at the breakfast table. I didn't know anyone could make me feel that much less alone with something that small. I hope she knows." Elias read both letters aloud to Lydia at the table, including that last part, and Lydia listened with her hands around her coffee, and when he finished, she said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "Write back to her. Tell her I know." He wrote the letter himself, at Lydia's direction, because she couldn't write it, and he could. And the process of the two of them composing it together, him with the pen, her with the words, both of them editing each other's instincts toward it, felt like something that deserved to be noticed, though he didn't say so. Spring came in the 3rd week of March, tentative and cold but present, and with it came the project. They spent 2 weeks planning the garden before they broke a single piece of ground, laying it out first in conversation, then in practice, with Lydia walking the dimensions and Elias driving stakes and stringing rope until she could walk every row without hesitation, until the system was as legible to her hands and feet as the cabin itself. She was specific about what she wanted where, and why, in a way that made clear she'd been thinking about it all winter. The root vegetables along the east wall where the soil drained best, the herbs on the south slope where they'd have full light, the kitchen staples, beans, squash, potato, in the long rows running north to south so the morning light hit them evenly. He did what she told him to do, mostly. Occasionally, he offered a structural objection, the kind based on knowing this specific soil and this specific elevation and the timing of the last frost. And she listened to those and incorporated them without making a thing of it in either direction. They didn't always agree, and the times they disagreed had the particular friction of two people who are both competent and know it, and working that friction out produced results that were better than either of them would have come to alone, which neither of them pointed out directly, but both understood. The dog came in April. The man in Mill Haven was named Gruber, and he bred large, heavy-coated mountain dogs of a mixed and unofficial ancestry that produced animals suited more to rough country than to any refined standard. He had a female, 2 years old, that he'd been keeping back from his usual sales because she had what he called a listening problem. She was less interested in commands than in her own assessment of situations, which he found frustrating, and which Elias, upon meeting her, found immediately understandable and not necessarily a problem depending on what you needed her for. Lydia had come with him, as promised. Millhaven was 40 miles from the cabin, and the day was long and cold, and the town was nothing much. Bigger than Redstone Crossing, with more commerce and more noise, but not by enough to be meaningfully different. They didn't see Crane, and Elias hadn't expected to. Men like Crane didn't linger in places where they'd lost. Gruber's farm was east of town, and the dog was in a pen with 2 others when they arrived, and she separated herself from the others when Lydia approached the pen fence, not dramatically, but with purpose, coming to the fence and sitting and regarding Lydia with the calm, evaluating attention of an animal that was making its own assessment of the situation. Lydia reached through the fence, and the dog sniffed her hand for a long moment, and then pressed her head into Lydia's palm with a deliberateness that was not quite trained behavior and not quite accident. "What's her name?" Lydia asked. "I call her Seven," Gruber said. "She was the 7th of the litter." Lydia considered this. "That's a terrible name." "I don't disagree," Gruber said. "I've been meaning to change it." "I'll take her," Lydia said, "and I'll name her myself." She named her May, for reasons she didn't explain, and May rode back up the mountain in the wagon with her head across Lydia's lap and her eyes half closed, and by the time they reached the cabin she had already, in the particular way of certain dogs, decided that Lydia was hers and arranged her behavior accordingly. May turned out to be exactly what Lydia had needed and more than either of them had expected. She was not easily excitable, which was valuable, right? She didn't bark at wind or small animals or the ordinary sounds of the mountain. But when something was wrong, or when someone was coming, she communicated it with a specificity that Lydia learned to read within a week. The quality of the low sound May made, the direction she faced, the degree of her alertness. She added a layer to Lydia's perception of the property that had been missing, and the effect on Lydia was visible in a way that Elias found quietly profound. Something in her shoulders that had never fully released in all the months she'd been here finally did. The last residue of a vigilance she'd been maintaining without fully knowing she was maintaining it. It was in May, on a warm afternoon, when the garden was showing its first green, and May was asleep on the porch in a patch of sunlight, that Elias said what he'd been building toward for months without quite knowing how to put it in front of her. They were sitting on the porch. Lydia was doing something with a length of rope. She'd been teaching herself knots the same way she taught herself everything, methodically and without asking for help until she knew what help she needed. He was sharpening a knife, the slow, rhythmic sound of steel on stone the only sound besides the birds and the creek at the bottom of the slope. He set the knife down. "Lydia." "Yes." He didn't have a practiced speech. He'd thought about one and discarded it because anything practiced would sound like something he'd prepared, and she'd hear the preparation in it and wonder what he was covering with the polish. "I want to marry you," he said. "I'm not offering you comfort or security or any of the things people usually put in that sentence, because I don't know how to make guarantees about things I don't control, and you'd know I was lying if I tried. What I can offer you is that I'm going to be here, that I'll tell you when I'm overriding your judgment and why, that I'll read to you and learn the rest of your knots and not pretend the loose board in the floor was never there." He paused. and that I think you're the most capable person I've encountered in 40 years of encountering people, and I would like to keep encountering you for the rest of whatever time there is." The rope went still in her hand. The creek ran at the bottom of the slope. May's ear flicked at something and relaxed again. "That's not very romantic," Lydia said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Most proposals have flowers, or at least a better-sounding reason. I can get flowers. The South Slope has some. I don't need flowers." She set the rope down in her lap. "I've been thinking about this," she said. "Not assuming, just thinking about what I'd say if you asked." She turned her face toward him, and the afternoon light was in her hair, and she looked like exactly who she was. Not softened or made beautiful by the light in the way of stories where everything resolves into an image, but present and real and entirely herself, which was better than an image. "Yes," she said, "but I have conditions. Tell me." "You finished the porch properly. It's been a structural suggestion for 3 years and it's embarrassing. Done. You teach me to use the rifle, not just the revolver, the rifle. Done. And you stop deciding what I should and shouldn't know about things that affect my safety, the way you did with the tracks in the snow." He was quiet for a moment. "That one I can promise to try. I can't promise to always get it right. Trying is enough," she said. "That's all I'm asking, that you try." She found his hand on the armrest of the chair and covered it with hers, briefly, the way she did things, without preamble, without the extended gesture of it, just directly. "Yes, Elias, I'll marry you." May lifted her head at the change in the quality of the silence, regarded them both for a moment with the philosophical expression of a dog who has seen many things and reserves judgment on all of them, and then put her head back down. They were married in June. The logistics of it were as unglamorous as you'd expect for a mountain cabin and 2 people with few connections to ceremony. Webb rode up from Redstone Crossing with a justice of the peace named Cutler, who had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen everything and been surprised by very little. And Clara Holt came up with Rose, who cried and was embarrassed about it and said she wasn't. And Mrs. Garfield sent a letter because the trail was too long for her knees. But the letter was, in the compressed way of the woman herself, genuinely warm. The ceremony was outside because the cabin was too small for 6 people and a large dog in any sense of occasion. The South Slope was flowering, not dramatically, not the kind of flowering that looks like a set piece from a distance, but the kind that happens because the season has simply arrived and the plants are doing what they do, small and real and scattered across the hillside with no regard for aesthetics. Lydia wore a dress that Clara had brought, dark blue, which Elias described to her when she asked, and which she said seemed appropriate. He wore the same coat he'd worn to every significant event in his adult life, which Rose pointed out had seen better decades and which Elias agreed with and didn't apologize for. Cutler read the necessary words with the measured pace of a man who understood that the words were a vessel, not the thing itself. When it was done, Webb shook Elias's hand with the firm grip of a man expressing approval without being sentimental about it. And Clara hugged Lydia with the brief, real warmth of a woman who doesn't hug people she doesn't mean it with. And Rose stood with May's head under her hand and looked at Lydia with an expression that contained, if you were reading it correctly, something of what it looks like when a person who has done a harmful thing finally sees the full reach of the correction it required. After the guests had come down the mountain and the light was going golden on the slope, Elias and Lydia sat on the porch together, which he had finished properly 2 weeks prior, and which was now a real porch, and not a suggestion of one. And the evening came in with the smell of the warm earth and the sound of the creek, and May asleep at their feet. "What are you here?" he asked her. He'd taken to asking her this sometimes, not to understand her blindness, but to understand what she heard that he didn't, because she heard things he missed. She was quiet for a moment, listening. "The creek. A bird I don't know the name of, east of us, same one that's been there all week. The pines in the light wind. They sound different in May than in January." A pause. "You're breathing." She turned her face toward him. "You breathe differently when you're not worried?" "How?" "Slower. More of it." She leaned her head slightly toward his shoulder. Not all the way, not dramatically, just the inclination of it. "You haven't been worried much lately." "No," he said, "I haven't." She leaned the rest of the way. They sat like that while the light changed and the evening deepened, and neither of them felt the need to fill it with anything, which was one of the things about what they had that he'd learned to recognize as valuable. The ability to be in a silence together without the silence becoming something to manage. He'd been alone in this cabin for 3 years before she came, and the silences had been one kind of thing, and since she'd been here they were a completely different kind of thing, and the difference was not something he could have accurately described before he experienced it. The summer grew, and the garden grew with it, better than either of them had expected for a first year. Not abundantly, not without setbacks. A week of unexpected cold in July that took half the beans and left them reassessing and replanting a portion of the east row, but substantially. Enough that by August, the shelves in the kitchen were holding things they'd grown themselves, and the ratio of what they needed from the general store had shifted meaningfully. Lydia moved through the garden with the ease of a person in a space she's built to her own specifications, which was what it was. She knew where every row was and what was in it and what it needed at what stage, and she maintained it with the organized, unhurried competence she brought to everything she'd decided to master. He helped when she wanted help, and learned when he didn't know something, which happened more often than he'd expected. He taught her the rifle, as promised, over 3 weeks of afternoons. It was harder than the revolver, longer, heavier, more complex to manage without sight. But she was stubborn in the particular way of people who know they can do a thing and simply need to work out the mechanism of it. And by the end of the 3rd week, she could load it herself and could hit a target at close range with a consistency that satisfied him, even if it didn't fully satisfy her. "I want to be better," she said, after a session that had gone well. "You're better than you were 3 weeks ago." "That's a low bar. Set your own bar," he said. "Just don't set it somewhere you can't reach yet. Work to it." She thought about this. "Is that what you did? With whatever you're still working on?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You're still carrying something from the frontier work," she said. Not accusing, just stating. "I can hear it sometimes, not often, but sometimes. In the way you go quiet in a way that's different from your regular quiet." She paused. "I'm not asking you to talk about it. I'm asking if you're working on it." He thought about it honestly, which she deserved. "Some days I am. Some days I just carry it." "That's an honest answer." "It's the only kind I know how to give you." She nodded slowly. "Me too," she said. "With my own things. Some days I work on it. Some days I just carry it." She turned back to the rifle, checking the load by feel. "I think that might be how it goes. With the heavy things." "Probably," he said. "As long as we're not carrying them alone," she said. "That's the difference. That's the only part that actually matters." He didn't say anything to that because she was right, and she knew she was right, and adding words to it would have been like adding paint to something that was already the right color. The autumn that followed was the most ordinary one he'd had in years, which was not a word he'd ever associated with goodness before, but had recalibrated somewhat in its meaning. Ordinary meant the same work in different weather, the garden coming in for winter, the traps going back out, the wood stacked higher and more carefully than before, because now there were 2 people who needed it through January. Ordinary meant May getting older in the easy, comfortable way of dogs that are well kept and know it. Ordinary meant evenings by the fire with the reading and the quiet, and occasionally an argument about something practical that resolved into a solution and left them both slightly irritated and slightly better off. Ordinary meant letters from Clara and Rose every few weeks, carrying the news of Redstone Crossing in Clara's efficient prose and Rose's sprawling personal one. Wesley Crane had not returned. His name came up less and less, and when it came up now, it came up in the past tense, which was where it belonged. The document in Briggs's courthouse ledger sat where it had always sat, doing the quiet work of existing, which was what documents needed to do. There would be other difficulties. He knew that the way you know things when you've lived long enough in rough country, not because you're pessimistic, but because you're honest about what terrain looks like over distance. The mountain would produce its problems. The world at the bottom of the mountain would produce its problems. People were what they were, and some of them would continue to be what Crane had been. And Lydia, moving through that world, would face the specific compounded difficulty of being a woman and being blind in a time and place that was not well designed for either. He knew that. She knew it better. What they also knew was that the thing that had been tested in those months, the trust that had grown in a spare room in a mountain cabin during a blizzard, that had been tried in the cold of a town square and the dark of a boarding house, and the steady daily work of two people learning each other's edges had held. Not perfectly, not without its moments of friction and failure and the particular small cruelties people sometimes inflict on each other simply by being imperfect and tired and human. But it had held, and holding mattered more than the shape of it. On a morning in late October, with the first serious snow of the season moving in from the northwest and May sitting at the door watching the sky with the weather-reading expression she'd developed sometime in August, Lydia said from the kitchen, "The south slope is going to be under a foot by noon." "At least," Elias agreed. He was at the window reading the same sky. "We should have brought the last of the squash in yesterday." "We should have." "I told you so." "You did." A pause. "Are you going to agree with me every time I say I told you so?" "Depends on whether you were right." "I'm usually right." "You are," he said. "It's occasionally annoying." She made the sound that had started as almost a smile and had, over months, become a real one. Not performed, not the muscle memory of an expression she used to know, but the actual thing, the way her face moved when something reached her. He'd learned to recognize it by the particular quality of her attention when it happened, the slight change in her breathing. "Get your coat," she said. "We need to get the squash." He got his coat. They went out into the early cold together, into the first light snow that was just beginning to find them, and May followed at their heels, and the mountain rose above them and surrounded them, impartial and enormous and indifferent to whether they were happy or struggling or somewhere in between, which was the thing about the mountain that he had come to find genuinely comforting. It did not require anything from them except that they be honest about what the terrain was. They were honest about it. They were, between the two of them, getting better at it all the time. The snow came down soft and steady, covering the garden in its winter patience, covering the trail and the tree line and the boulder at the first bend where Rose had sat that cold morning with her hands twisted together and her heavy coat and her 2 years of silence finally reaching its end. It covered the porch where they'd been married and the lean-to where the animals were already settled in their winter arrangement, and the small cleared path between the two that they'd walked so many times, it had worn itself into the ground. It covered all of it, the way it covered everything up here, without distinction or preference, making the whole mountain one clean surface, and underneath that surface, alive and dormant and waiting for spring, everything they'd planted.